The call came in at 11:23 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October, just as I was settling down with a cup of truck stop coffee and thinking about grabbing some shut-eye in the sleeper berth of my Kenworth. 26 years I'd been driving these Texas highways, and I should have known better than to answer the phone that late. Nothing good ever comes from midnight dispatch calls. My name's Buck Williams, and I run freight between Dallas and the Gulf Coast, mostly automotive parts and industrial equipment for the petrochemical plants down in Beaumont and Port Arthur. It's honest work that pays decent money, and after more than 2 decades behind the wheel, I know every mile of highway between here and Louisiana like the back of my calloused hands. "Buck, this is Eddie at Richardson Freight," came the familiar voice of my dispatcher. Eddie Carmichael had been sending me loads for the better part of 8 years, ever since I started running independent after my divorce. He was reliable, paid on time, and never sent me on wild goose chases for fictional cargo. "What you got for me, Eddie?" I asked, settling back in my driver's seat and watching the late-night traffic roll past on I-20. "Emergency run down to Beaumont. Chemical plant equipment that broke down this afternoon, and they need replacement parts first thing in the morning, or they're looking at shutting down an entire production line. Customers willing to pay premium rates for immediate delivery." That got my attention. Premium rates in the trucking business usually meant time and a half, sometimes double pay if the situation was desperate enough. With Christmas coming up in a couple months, and my daughter starting her second year of college, I could use the extra money. "What kind of equipment we talking about? Pump assemblies, valve components, some kind of specialized gaskets? Nothing hazardous, just heavy. About 32,000 pounds total, all skidded and ready to load. Pickups at Hartman Industrial Supply over in Grand Prairie. Delivery to Eastman Chemical in Beaumont." I knew both locations. Hartman was a legitimate outfit I'd picked up from before, and Eastman Chemical was one of the biggest employers in southeast Texas. The job sounded straightforward enough. "What's the pay?" $1,800 for the round trip, plus fuel surcharge, cash on delivery." That was nearly double my usual rate for a Beaumont run. Either Eastman Chemical was truly desperate to get their equipment, or there was something about this load that Eddie wasn't telling me. But $1,800 was $1,800, and I'd hauled stranger cargo for less money. "I'll take it," I said. "How long do I have?" "Pickup's available now. Delivery needs to be completed by 7 a.m. That gives you about 7.5 hours to make a 4-hour drive, so you'll have time for breaks and fuel stops." I did the math in my head. Grand Prairie to Beaumont via I-20 East and I-10 South was about 280 miles, mostly interstate driving through familiar territory. Even allowing for construction zones and the occasional traffic backup, I could make the run in 4 hours and still have time to grab breakfast in Beaumont before the delivery. "Send me the paperwork," I said. "I'll head over to Hartman's right now." "Buck," Eddie said, and something in his tone made me pay attention. "Customer was real specific about the route. Wants you to take Highway 87 south from Beaumont instead of coming back up through Houston. Something about avoiding industrial traffic around the ship channel." Highway 87 was a 2-lane coastal road that ran along the Gulf of Mexico from Beaumont down to Galveston. It was scenic enough, especially during the day, but it added about 50 miles to the return trip and took you through some pretty isolated country. Most truckers avoided it because the road was narrow, had weight restrictions on some bridges, and offered limited services for big rigs. "That's going to add an hour to my drive time," I said. "Customers paying for the extra miles. Part of that premium rate includes routing requirements." I shrugged and fired up the Kenworth. "Their money, their choice. I'll be at Hartman's in 30 minutes. Hartman Industrial Supply was located in an industrial district of Grand Prairie that looked exactly like every other industrial district in Texas. Rows of metal buildings, fenced yards full of equipment, and security lights that turned everything a sickly yellow color. I'd been there maybe a dozen times over the years, usually picking up pump parts or valve assemblies for refineries along the coast. The night loading crew was waiting for me when I backed up to the dock. 3 guys in company coveralls who looked like they'd rather be home sleeping than loading trucks at midnight. Can't say I blamed them. The forklift operator, a heavy-set Mexican guy named Carlos, who I'd met on previous pickups, seemed unusually quiet as he loaded the skids into my trailer. Normally, Carlos was friendly and talkative, always asking about road conditions or sharing gossip from other drivers. But tonight he kept his head down and focused on his work with an intensity that seemed forced. "Everything all right, Carlos?" I asked as he positioned the last skid near the front of my trailer. He glanced around to make sure the other workers weren't listening, then stepped closer to me. "Buck, I've been loading trucks here for 12 years, and I ain't never seen equipment like this before." "What do you mean?" "Look at them crates real close. That ain't pump parts in there." I walked into my trailer and examined the cargo more carefully. The skids were loaded with wooden crates that were stenciled with part numbers and shipping labels, but Carlos was right. Something felt off. The crates were the wrong size and shape for pump assemblies, and they were secured with more heavy-duty steel banding than you'd normally see for industrial equipment. "What do you think it is?" I asked. Carlos shook his head. "Don't know, and don't want to know. But the paperwork came down from the front office with a note that nobody was supposed to ask questions about this shipment. In 12 years, I ain't never seen that before." He finished securing my load, and I signed the bills of lading, but something about Carlos's warning was bothering me. I'd hauled enough legitimate cargo to know what normal industrial equipment looked and felt like, and this load had a different quality to it. The crates were too uniform, too carefully constructed, and way too heavy for the components they were supposed to contain. But I also knew that curiosity had killed more than a few truckers over the years. Sometimes cargo was classified. Sometimes it was prototype equipment that companies wanted to keep secret, and sometimes it was just expensive enough that everyone involved got paranoid about security. As long as the paperwork was in order and the load was legal, my job was to deliver it safely and on time. I pulled out of Hartman's loading dock and headed south on I-20, planning to cut over to I-45 south and then pick up I-10 east toward Beaumont. The late-night traffic was light, mostly other truckers making overnight runs and the occasional commuter heading home from a late shift. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. My Kenworth was handling the load well. My fuel consumption was within expected parameters, and I was making good time through the familiar countryside east of Dallas. I had the CB radio tuned to channel 19, listening to the usual trucker chatter about road conditions, speed traps, and the quality of food at various truck stops. But somewhere around Tyler, things started to feel wrong. The first sign of trouble was the smell. About an hour into the trip, I started noticing an odd odor seeping into my cab. Not the usual diesel fumes or industrial chemical smell you'd expect from highway driving, but something organic and unpleasant. It reminded me of the time a deer had died under my neighbor's house and rotted there for a week before we found it. I pulled over at a truck stop in Longview to check my cargo and make sure nothing had shifted or broken open. The trailer doors were still sealed with the metal bands that Hartman's crew had applied, and there was no visible damage to any of the crates. But the smell was definitely stronger near the back of the trailer, and it was getting worse. I tried calling Eddie to report the problem, but my cell phone couldn't get a signal. That was unusual. Most of East Texas had decent coverage, especially along the interstate corridors. I tried my CB radio, but all I could pick up was static and the occasional burst of what sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. An old-timer at the truck stop fuel island noticed me walking around my trailer with a puzzled expression. "Having trouble with your load, driver?" he asked. His name patch read Dale, and he had the kind of weathered face that comes from 30 years of highway driving. "Something smells off," I said. "Paperwork says it's pump parts, but it doesn't smell like any industrial equipment I've ever hauled." Dale walked over to my trailer and took a sniff near the doors. His expression immediately changed, and he stepped back with a look of disgust. "Son, I don't know what you got in there, but that ain't pump parts. That smells like—" He paused, as if trying to identify something familiar but unpleasant. "Hell, I don't rightly know what that smells like, but it ain't good. You think I should open it up and take a look? I think you should call your dispatcher and find out what you're really hauling, and if you can't get a hold of him, you might want to consider calling the DOT or the state police." But when I tried calling Eddie again, the phone just rang endlessly with no answer. His voicemail wasn't even picking up, which was strange because Eddie's phone was connected to an answering service that operated 24 hours a day. Dale helped me check my trailer more thoroughly, and that's when we found something that made both of us take a step back. Near the bottom of the trailer doors, where the metal seal met the frame, there was a dark liquid seeping out. Not much, just a few drops that had formed a small puddle on the asphalt, but enough to confirm that something inside my cargo was leaking. "Brother," Dale said, shaking his head, "you need to get that trailer to a safe location and figure out what's going on. That liquid don't look natural." The liquid was dark reddish-brown, thick like syrup, and it had the same foul odor that was permeating my cab. When Dale touched it with a stick, it clung to the wood like partially congealed blood. "I got a delivery to make," I said, though I was starting to question whether I wanted to complete this particular run. "You got a responsibility to other drivers on the road," Dale replied. "If that stuff is hazardous and you have an accident, you could kill innocent people." He had a point, but I also had $1,800 waiting for me in Beaumont, and I'd never failed to complete a delivery in 26 years of driving. I decided to continue toward Beaumont but take extra precautions, drive slower, avoid populated areas when possible, and keep my windows cracked to prevent any buildup of fumes in the cab. Dale shook his head as I climbed back into my truck. "You're funeral driver, but if I was you, I'd be real careful about what you're getting yourself into." I left the truck stop in Longview and continued east on I-20, but the atmosphere in my cab had changed completely. What started as a routine delivery run was feeling more and more like a journey into something dangerous and unknown. The smell from my trailer was getting stronger despite my efforts to ventilate the cab, and the dark liquid was apparently still seeping from the cargo area. Around Marshall, Texas, I started noticing that other drivers were giving me a wide berth on the highway. Trucks that would normally pass on the left were staying well behind me, and several drivers on the CB were making comments about that Kenworth with the stinking load. Apparently, the odor was strong enough to be detected by other vehicles at highway speeds. "Eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 6117, came a voice over Channel 19. "You got something nasty going on back there. Smells like something died in your trailer." I keyed my mic to respond, but all that came through the speaker was static and what sounded like whispered voices speaking too quietly to understand. My CB radio was malfunctioning, cutting in and out with electronic interference that made communication impossible. That's when I started seeing the birds. At first, it was just a few crows following my truck at a distance, flying parallel to the highway and keeping pace with my 65 mph speed. Nothing too unusual. Crows are smart birds, and they often follow vehicles that might provide roadkill opportunities. But as I continued east, more birds joined the group. Dozens of them, then hundreds, forming a dark cloud that moved with my truck like a living shadow. Other drivers were noticing too. I could see truckers in oncoming traffic slowing down and pointing at the massive flock of birds that was accompanying my Kenworth down the interstate. It was like something out of a horror movie, a black cloud of wings and beaks that seemed drawn to whatever I was carrying in my trailer. By the time I reached the intersection with I-49 near Marshall, the bird phenomenon had attracted attention from other sources as well. I saw a Texas Highway Patrol car pacing me from about a quarter-mile back, probably trying to figure out what was causing the unusual wildlife behavior. I pulled over at a rest area to see if I could get the situation under control, but the moment my truck stopped moving, things got worse. The birds landed on my truck, my trailer, the pavement around my rig. Hundreds of crows, ravens, and other blackbirds that covered every available surface. They weren't aggressive or threatening, but they were clearly attracted to something in my cargo. The highway patrol officer pulled into the rest area behind me and got out of his car with a puzzled expression. He was a young trooper, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of crisp uniform and serious demeanor that suggested he took his job very seriously. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of your vehicle," he called out, trying to make himself heard over the cawing of hundreds of birds. I climbed down from my cab, and immediately the smell hit me with full force. Outside the enclosed environment of my truck, the odor from my trailer was overwhelming, a combination of decay, chemicals, and something else that I couldn't identify but that made my stomach turn. "Officer, I'm transporting industrial equipment to Beaumont," I said. "I don't know what's causing this bird situation." "What kind of equipment?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook and pen. "Pump parts, valve components, gaskets, standard chemical plant supplies." The trooper walked toward my trailer, and the birds immediately parted to give him a path while remaining perched on every other available surface. When he got close to the rear doors, he stopped abruptly and covered his nose with his hand. "Sir, that doesn't smell like any industrial equipment I've ever encountered. I'm going to need to see your shipping papers and inspect your cargo." I handed him the bills of lading and manifest, which he studied carefully while the birds watched from their perches with what seemed like unusual intelligence. Several of the larger ravens were tilting their heads and making soft clicking sounds, as if they were trying to communicate. "According to these documents, you're carrying pump assemblies and valve components manufactured by Hartman Industrial Supply," the trooper said. "But I've got to tell you, sir, this situation with the birds and this smell suggests that your cargo might not be what your paperwork indicates." "Officer, I loaded this freight myself at Hartman's facility. I watched them put crated pump parts into my trailer." "Then you won't mind if I take a look inside?" He walked to the back of my trailer and examined the metal security bands that sealed the doors. But when he tried to cut the bands with the wire cutters from his patrol car, something unexpected happened. The moment the metal seal was broken, a sound emerged from inside my trailer that made both of us step back in alarm. It was a low, rhythmic noise that sounded almost like breathing. Not mechanical breathing, like a compressor or pneumatic system, but organic breathing. Deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that suggested something large and alive was inside my trailer. The trooper drew his sidearm and motioned for me to move away from the truck. "Sir, I need you to stand back while I investigate this situation." The birds were getting more agitated as well, their cawing becoming louder and more frantic. Some of them were flapping their wings without taking flight, as if they wanted to get closer to whatever was in my trailer, but were afraid to approach. "Officer," I said, "I think we should call for backup before you open those doors." But it was too late. The breathing sound from inside my trailer was getting louder, and the rear doors were starting to bulge outward, as if something inside was pressing against them. Whatever I had loaded at Hartman Industrial Supply, it definitely wasn't pump parts. The highway patrol officer called for backup while keeping his weapon drawn and pointed at my trailer. The breathing sound was getting more pronounced, and now we could hear other noises as well, scratching, scraping, and what sounded like movement of something very large shifting around inside the cargo area. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47 at the rest area on I-20 eastbound at mile marker 625. The trooper spoke into his radio. "I need immediate backup and a hazmat team. We have a commercial vehicle with unknown cargo that's exhibiting unusual biological activity." The birds were becoming increasingly agitated, with some of them taking flight and circling overhead while others remained perched on my truck, moving restlessly and making sounds I'd never heard crows make before. It was like they were trying to warn us about something. "Buck," the trooper said, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened during your loading process at Hartman's. Did you see what was inside those crates?" "No, sir.
The crates were already sealed when the forklift operator loaded them. But Carlos, that's the guy who loaded me, said something seemed off about the cargo. Said he'd never seen equipment like that in 12 years of working there. The trailer doors were bulging more noticeably now, and we could see dark liquid seeping from the bottom edge where I'd first noticed it at the truck stop in Longview. But the liquid wasn't just seeping anymore. It was flowing steadily, forming a pool underneath my trailer that was attracting flies and other insects. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move your patrol car upwind from my truck," I told the trooper. "That smell is getting worse, and I don't think we want to breathe too much of whatever's coming out of there." 3 more highway patrol cars arrived within 15 minutes, along with a fire department hazmat truck and an ambulance.
The scene at the rest area was starting to look like a major incident, with emergency vehicles, flashing lights, and a growing crowd of birds that showed no signs of dispersing. The incident commander, a senior trooper named Sergeant Martinez, took charge of the situation and immediately established a perimeter around my truck. He'd been dealing with hazmat incidents for over 20 years and had the kind of calm professionalism that comes from experience with dangerous situations. "We're going to treat this as a potential biological hazard until we can determine what's actually in that trailer," he told me. "I need you to give me a complete account of your pickup and delivery instructions." I told him everything. Eddie's late-night call, the premium rate for emergency delivery, the unusual routing instructions, Carlos's warning about the cargo, and my failed attempts to contact my dispatcher. Sergeant Martinez took notes and asked detailed questions about the shipping company, the delivery address, and the specific type of equipment I was supposed to be hauling. "Sergeant," one of the hazmat technicians called out, "we're getting some unusual readings on our sensors. Whatever's in that trailer is generating significant amounts of methane, hydrogen sulfide, and some organic compounds we can't immediately identify. Is it safe to open the trailer? Not until we can get better ventilation and full protective equipment. Whatever's producing these gases could be dangerous to human health." That's when we heard the sound that made everyone at the scene take several steps back from my truck. From inside the trailer came a noise that was unmistakably human, a low moaning sound that rose and fell like someone in pain or distress. "Jesus Christ," one of the younger troopers said. "There's somebody alive in there." Sergeant Martinez immediately radioed for additional ambulances and began coordinating a rescue operation. But as the hazmat team prepared to open my trailer doors with full protective gear, I started to realize that this situation was far beyond anything I'd ever encountered in 26 years of trucking. "Buck," Sergeant Martinez said, "I need you to understand that you're probably going to be detained for questioning once we determine what's in your trailer. If there are people inside, we're looking at potential kidnapping charges, human trafficking, or worse." "Sergeant, I swear I had no idea what I was carrying. I thought it was legitimate industrial equipment." "I believe you. But that doesn't change the legal situation. Someone used you to transport something illegal, and we need to find out who and why." The hazmat team positioned fans and ventilation equipment around my trailer, then approached the rear doors wearing full protective suits with self-contained breathing apparatus. The birds scattered as the technicians began the process of carefully opening the trailer, but they didn't go far. They perched on nearby trees and continued watching the operation with apparent fascination. The first thing that emerged when the doors opened was a wave of stench that was strong enough to be detected even through the team's protective equipment. The lead technician immediately signaled for everyone to move further back and called for additional ventilation. "We've got multiple large containers inside," his voice crackled through the radio. "They appear to be some kind of specialized shipping crates, but they're not consistent with normal industrial equipment. Any sign of human occupants? Stand by." The hazmat technician moved deeper into my trailer with a powerful flashlight, and his voice came back over the radio with a tone that immediately got everyone's attention. "Sergeant, you need to see this. We don't have people in here, but we've got something that explains the biological readings." What the hazmat team found in my trailer wasn't pump parts or valve components. It wasn't human trafficking victims or kidnapped people. It was something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the cargo I'd been carrying for the past 4 hours. The crates were filled with animal carcasses, dozens of them, in various stages of decomposition. Deer, wild hogs, cattle, and other large animals that appeared to have been dead for several days or weeks. But these weren't normal animal remains. They had been processed in some way, with surgical incisions, removed organs, and what looked like experimental modifications that suggested some kind of biological research or testing. "We're looking at approximately 40 animal specimens," the hazmat technician reported. "Multiple species, all showing signs of systematic dissection and organ removal. Some of the carcasses appear to have been injected with preservative chemicals, which explains the odors and gas emissions we've been detecting." Sergeant Martinez ordered photographs of everything and called for a veterinary pathologist to examine the remains. The birds that had been following my truck were still gathered in the area, and now their behavior made more sense. They were responding to the smell of carrion, drawn by instincts that had evolved over millions of years. "Buck," the sergeant said, "I need you to think carefully about your dispatcher and the company that hired you for this run. Have you ever transported anything like this before?" "Never," I said, and I meant it. In 26 years of trucking, I'd hauled everything from livestock to hazardous chemicals, but I'd never been involved in anything that involved illegal disposal of animal remains or unauthorized biological research. "What can you tell me about Richardson Freight? How long have you been working with them?" "About 8 years. Eddie Carmichael is my regular dispatcher, and he's always been straight with me. Nothing but legitimate loads, automotive parts, industrial equipment, construction materials. This is completely out of character for him." One of the state troopers came over with a clipboard full of notes. "Sergeant, we ran the company information through our database. Richardson Freight Services is a legitimate trucking company based in Dallas, but they have no record of dispatching this load. In fact, their dispatcher Eddie Carmichael is currently on vacation in Colorado and hasn't been in the office for 3 days." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone had impersonated my dispatcher, created fake shipping documents, and arranged for me to pick up illegal cargo while thinking I was making a routine delivery. I'd been set up as an unwitting accomplice in whatever illegal operation was behind the transportation of these animal remains. "Who paid for the loading at Hartman Industrial Supply?" Sergeant Martinez asked. "According to the paperwork, the customer was Eastman Chemical in Beaumont. But if the load is fake, the payment authorization was probably fake too." The state troopers contacted Hartman Industrial Supply and discovered that the night loading crew had processed the shipment based on what appeared to be legitimate purchase orders and payment authorization from Eastman Chemical. But when they called Eastman Chemical, the company had no record of ordering any emergency equipment or authorizing any shipments from Hartman. "This was a sophisticated operation," Sergeant Martinez explained. "Someone created fake documents, impersonated multiple companies, and arranged for the transportation of illegal cargo while making it appear to be a legitimate business transaction." "But why use me?" I asked. "Why not just hire a truck and driver who were in on the operation?" "Because they needed someone with a clean record and no knowledge of what they were really transporting. If you'd been stopped for a routine inspection, you would have appeared to be an innocent driver carrying legitimate cargo. Your genuine confusion would have been the best possible cover story." The veterinary pathologist arrived and began examining the animal remains while crime scene technicians documented everything and collected evidence. What they discovered was even more disturbing than the initial findings. "These animals weren't just killed for their organs," the pathologist explained. "They show signs of systematic experimentation, injection sites, surgical modifications, and evidence of various chemicals and drugs being tested on them. This looks like an illegal animal research operation, possibly involving the development of biological agents or pharmaceutical compounds." "Any idea who might be behind something like this?" "Could be anything from unlicensed pharmaceutical research to biological weapons development.
But whoever was running this operation had access to veterinary facilities, trained personnel, and enough resources to process dozens of large animals. The crime scene investigation continued for several more hours, with federal agents from the FBI and DEA joining the state and local law enforcement officers. My truck and trailer were impounded as evidence, and I was transported to a state police facility for extensive questioning about my role in the operation. But the most disturbing part of the whole experience was what I learned about the delivery address in Beaumont. During my interview with federal agents, I learned that the delivery address I'd been given, Eastman Chemical Company in Beaumont, was real, but the specific location was an abandoned industrial facility that had been closed for over 2 years. Someone had chosen a legitimate company name and used the address of a facility that would have been dark and empty when I arrived for the delivery. What would have happened if I'd completed the delivery? I asked Special Agent Sarah Crawford from the FBI's Houston field office. You probably would have been met by individuals who would have unloaded your trailer and paid you in cash, as promised. They might have offered you additional similar loads at premium rates. Eventually, they would have drawn you deeper into their operation until you either became a willing participant or you learned too much and became a liability. A liability? Drivers who get too curious about illegal cargo have a tendency to disappear, Mr. Williams. We've investigated several cases over the past few years where truckers accepted suspicious loads and were never seen again. Agent Crawford showed me photographs of 5 other independent truck drivers who had disappeared while hauling cargo for companies that later turned out to be fronts for illegal operations. All of them were experienced drivers with clean records. All had been offered high-paying loads with unusual pickup or delivery requirements, and all had vanished without a trace. We believe your case represents a new development in how these organizations recruit transportation, she explained. Instead of using drivers who are already involved in criminal activity, they're targeting legitimate truckers and deceiving them into transporting illegal cargo. It's more expensive and complicated, but it provides better security and reduces the risk of detection. How did they know to target me specifically? That's what we're trying to determine. Someone had access to information about your driving record, your financial situation, your work patterns, and your relationship with Richardson Freight. They knew enough to successfully impersonate your dispatcher and create a scenario that you would find believable. The investigation revealed that several other truckers had received similar late-night calls offering high-paying loads with premium rates and unusual requirements. Most of them had declined the offers because something felt wrong, but 3 drivers had accepted loads and were currently missing. "We think you were lucky," Agent Crawford said. "The animal remains in your trailer suggest that whoever organized this operation was involved in something extremely dangerous. If you had completed the delivery, you might not have made it home." Over the following weeks, federal agents traced the fake shipping documents, payment authorizations, and communication systems used to arrange my pickup. What they discovered was a sophisticated criminal network that operated across multiple states and was involved in various illegal activities, including drug manufacturing, biological weapons research, and human trafficking. The animal remains in my trailer were apparently being used to test chemical compounds and biological agents before they were deployed against human targets. The surgical modifications and experimental injections were designed to determine the effects of various substances on living tissue and organ systems. This was basically a mobile laboratory, Agent Crawford explained. They were using trucks to transport their test subjects and research materials between facilities, making it harder for law enforcement to track their operations. The network behind my fake delivery was eventually disrupted by a joint federal task force, but not before several other truckers were drawn into the operation. Some were arrested as unwitting accomplices, others disappeared entirely, and a few managed to escape when they realized they were being used for illegal purposes. My truck and trailer were eventually returned to me after months of evidence processing, but the experience had permanently changed my approach to the trucking business.
I became much more cautious about accepting loads from unfamiliar companies, started verifying all dispatch calls independently, and developed a network of contacts who could help confirm the legitimacy of suspicious shipments. The months following my encounter with the fake biological research cargo were some of the most difficult of my trucking career. Word had spread through the industry about my involvement in the federal investigation, and some companies were reluctant to work with drivers who had been connected to criminal activity, even as unwitting victims. But there were also positive developments. The FBI asked me to serve as a consultant for their investigation into freight-related criminal activity, helping them understand how legitimate truckers could be targeted and manipulated by criminal organizations. I started speaking at trucking industry conferences about cargo security and how to identify potentially fraudulent shipping arrangements. Most importantly, I connected with other drivers who had similar experiences. Through online trucking forums and industry publications, I found dozens of other independent operators who had been approached with suspicious, high-paying loads or had encountered unusual cargo that didn't match their shipping documents. One driver, a veteran named Dale Peterson from Oklahoma, had been offered a similar late-night emergency run just 2 weeks before my experience. His load was supposed to be medical equipment being transported to a hospital in Louisiana, but something about the pickup felt wrong, and he declined the job. The dispatcher knew too much about my personal situation, Dale explained when we met at a truck stop outside of Dallas. Knew about my truck payments, knew about my daughter's medical bills, knew exactly how to make an offer I couldn't afford to refuse. But 30 years of driving teaches you to trust your instincts, and my instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Another driver, Linda Rodriguez from Arizona, had actually completed a delivery similar to mine, but had become suspicious when the receiving facility appeared to be abandoned. She'd left the cargo at the specified location and collected her payment, but later learned from FBI agents that she had transported precursor chemicals used in the manufacture of illegal drugs. The scary part is how professional the whole operation was, Linda said. The paperwork was perfect. The payment authorization went through without any problems, and the people I dealt with seemed completely legitimate. If I hadn't started asking questions afterward, I never would have known I was used in a criminal operation. Through these connections, we discovered that freight-related criminal activity was far more common than most truckers realized. Criminal organizations were increasingly using legitimate transportation companies and independent drivers to move illegal goods, often without the driver's knowledge or consent. The FBI estimated that several hundred truckers had been unknowingly involved in criminal transportation over the past 5 years, carrying everything from drug manufacturing equipment to human trafficking victims to biological weapons research materials. The trucking industry's size and complexity make it an ideal cover for criminal activity, Agent Crawford explained during one of our follow-up meetings. With over 3 million trucks on the road at any given time, it's nearly impossible to inspect every load or verify every shipping document. Criminal organizations exploit this reality by creating fake companies, false documentation, and elaborate cover stories. 6 months after my incident, I received a call from Eddie Carmichael, the real Eddie Carmichael from Richardson Freight Services. He had returned from vacation and learned about the impersonation of his identity and company. "Buck, I want you to know that Richardson Freight is implementing new security procedures to prevent this kind of thing from happening again," Eddie said. "All dispatch calls will now be verified through multiple channels, and we're requiring photo identification for all drivers at pickup locations." "I appreciate that, Eddie. But I got to ask, how did someone get enough information about our working relationship to successfully impersonate you?" "That's what's really scary about this whole situation. The criminals had access to our internal communications, our driver databases, even our payment systems. The FBI thinks our computer systems were compromised for months before your incident. The cybersecurity investigation revealed that the criminal network had infiltrated computer systems at dozens of trucking companies, freight brokers, and shipping facilities. They had been collecting information about drivers, loads, and payment arrangements for over 2 years, building profiles of potential targets and developing increasingly sophisticated methods for manipulating the transportation industry. The experience with the fake biological research cargo taught me that the trucking industry was facing threats that most drivers weren't even aware of. Criminal organizations had evolved beyond simple cargo theft or drug smuggling. They were now using sophisticated techniques to manipulate legitimate drivers into unknowingly participating in illegal operations. I developed a set of personal safety protocols that I shared with other independent truckers through industry forums and CB radio networks. The rules were simple but potentially life-saving. Always verify dispatch calls independently using known phone numbers rather than caller ID. Never accept loads that require immediate pickup without proper advance notice. Be suspicious of any cargo that doesn't match your normal freight categories, especially high-paying loads with unusual routing requirements. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong about a load, a pickup location, or a delivery address, walk away regardless of how much money is involved. 3 months after my incident, I got a chance to test these protocols when I received another late-night call offering a high-paying emergency run. This time, the caller claimed to be from a company called Lone Star Industrial Transport, offering double rates to haul what he described as time-sensitive chemical processing equipment from Houston to a facility near Corpus Christi. Instead of accepting immediately, I asked for the company's DOT number, their physical address, and a callback number where I could verify the load independently. The caller became evasive and insisted that the load had to be picked up within 2 hours, or it would be offered to another driver. "That's fine," I told him. "Offer it to someone else." The caller hung up, and when I tried to research Lone Star Industrial Transport, I discovered that no such company existed in Texas Department of Transportation records. 2 days later, I learned from law enforcement contacts that another driver had accepted that same load and had disappeared somewhere between Houston and Corpus Christi. His truck was found abandoned at a rest area near Victoria, Texas, with no cargo and no sign of what had happened to the driver. By the first anniversary of my fake cargo incident, I had connected with over 50 other truckers who had encountered similar situations. Some had been tricked into hauling illegal cargo. Others had escaped suspicious situations by trusting their instincts, and several had lost friends or colleagues who had disappeared after accepting questionable loads. We formed an informal network that we called the Road Watch. Independent truckers who shared information about suspicious shipping companies, dangerous delivery locations, and freight arrangements that seemed too good to be true. We used CB radio channels, online trucking forums, and word-of-mouth communications to warn other drivers about potential threats. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies began working with our network, providing tips about ongoing investigations and asking us to report any suspicious activity we encountered. Agent Crawford became our primary law enforcement contact, and she regularly updated us on new criminal techniques and emerging threats. "What you drivers are doing is invaluable," she told us during one of our informal meetings at a truck stop outside of San Antonio. "You see patterns and detect problems that formal law enforcement investigations might miss. The trucking community's willingness to look out for each other is one of the most effective tools we have for combating freight-related crime." But our network also revealed just how extensive the problem had become. We documented over 200 cases of suspicious freight arrangements, driver disappearances, and criminal manipulation of the transportation industry. The scope of the problem suggested that multiple criminal organizations were using similar techniques to exploit truckers across the country. One of the most disturbing discoveries was that several legitimate trucking companies had been infiltrated by criminals who were using company resources to facilitate illegal operations. Dispatchers, safety managers, and even company executives were being blackmailed, bribed, or coerced into cooperating with criminal networks.
It's like fighting a hydra, explained Tom Morrison, a veteran driver from New Mexico who had narrowly escaped a human trafficking operation disguised as a furniture delivery. You shut down one criminal network, and two more pop up using slightly different techniques. The criminal organizations were also adapting to our countermeasures. They began using more sophisticated background research to target drivers, created more convincing fake companies and documentation, and developed new methods for avoiding detection by law enforcement. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated the solidarity and communication skills of the American trucking community. 8 months after the fake cargo incident, I thought the worst was behind me. I'd settled into a routine of verified loads from established companies, implemented my security protocols, and was helping other drivers through the Road Watch network. Then, on a cold February night while I was parked at a Love's truck stop outside of Waco, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. The caller ID showed Richardson Freight Services, the real company, not the imposters who had tricked me before. But I'd learned not to trust caller ID, so I let it go to voicemail and called Richardson's main number from their website. "Richardson Freight, night dispatch. This is Eddie." It was actually Eddie Carmichael, my regular dispatcher. His voice was tense, and I could hear unusual background noise. Voices, phones ringing, what sounded like a lot of activity for the middle of the night. "Eddie, it's Buck. Did you just call me?" "Buck, thank God you answered. We got a serious situation here, and I need a driver I can trust absolutely. Someone's been impersonating our company again, and we think they're targeting our regular drivers." "What kind of situation?" 3 of our drivers accepted loads in the past week from people claiming to be Richardson Freight dispatchers. All 3 loads were fake. All 3 drivers are now missing, and the FBI is crawling all over our office. My blood went cold. Missing how? Jerry Hoskins disappeared somewhere between Austin and Houston on Tuesday. Danny Crenshaw vanished on a run from Dallas to El Paso on Thursday. And Carl Morrison, you remember Carl runs the western routes? His truck was found abandoned at a rest stop near Fort Stockton yesterday. No sign of him, no cargo, and his CB radio was still on with someone asking for help. I knew all 3 drivers. Jerry had been with Richardson for 12 years, Danny for 8, and Carl was practically a legend in Texas trucking circles, 35 years behind the wheel without a single serious accident. "Eddie, what makes you think I can help?" "Agent Crawford from the FBI thinks this is connected to your original incident. The fake dispatchers are using the same techniques, the same types of offers, but now they're specifically targeting drivers who've worked with Richardson Freight. They're coming after us personally. That's what it looks like. Buck, I need you to come to Dallas. The FBI wants to debrief you on the missing drivers, and they think you might be the next target." I fired up my Kenworth and headed north on I-35, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every set of headlights in my mirrors looked suspicious. Every truck stop seemed potentially dangerous, and every CB transmission made me wonder if someone was monitoring my movements. The Richardson Freight Terminal in Dallas looked like a crime scene when I arrived at 6 a.m. FBI vehicles, state police cars, and unmarked government sedans filled the parking lot. Inside, agents were interviewing drivers, examining shipping records, and setting up what appeared to be a major investigation. Agent Crawford met me at the security office and immediately escorted me to a conference room where several other law enforcement officials were waiting. The lead investigator was a tall, serious man named Deputy Director Frank Martinez from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. "Mr. Williams," Director Martinez said, "we believe your original incident 8 months ago was the beginning of a targeted campaign against the Texas trucking industry. The same criminal organization has now escalated to kidnapping drivers and using their identities to infiltrate transportation networks." "What do you mean, using their identities?" Agent Crawford pulled out a file folder containing photographs and documents. The 3 missing Richardson Freight drivers didn't just disappear. Someone has been impersonating them, using their names and credentials to pick up loads from other trucking companies. She showed me security camera footage from a warehouse in Houston where someone who looked remarkably like Jerry Hoskins had picked up a load of electronic equipment using Jerry's real credentials and driver's license number. "But that's not Jerry," I said, studying the video. "The build is right, the general appearance is right, but something about his mannerisms is off." "Exactly. We think the criminal organization is using sophisticated identity theft techniques, possibly including plastic surgery or other physical modifications, to create drivers who can pass casual inspection but aren't the real individuals." Director Martinez leaned forward across the conference table. "Mr. Williams, we want to use you as bait." "Excuse me?" "We believe you'll be contacted soon with another suspicious load offer. When that happens, we want you to accept it and allow us to track the operation from beginning to end. With proper surveillance and backup, we can follow the trail back to whoever is orchestrating these disappearances. And if something goes wrong, you'll have full federal protection. Surveillance teams, electronic monitoring, backup drivers positioned along your route. But we need someone the criminals will trust. Someone with a history they can verify." Agent Crawford opened another folder. "Buck, we've discovered that all the missing drivers had certain characteristics in common. They were independent contractors with flexible schedules. They had clean driving records. They lived alone or had limited family connections, and they had previously encountered suspicious cargo situations. They were recruiting specific types of drivers." "Exactly. And unfortunately, you fit their profile perfectly." 3 days later, my phone rang at 1:43 a.m. while I was parked at a truck stop in Killeen. The caller claimed to be from a company called Lone Star Express Transport, offering triple rates for an urgent delivery of industrial cleaning equipment from a warehouse outside of Austin to a chemical plant near Corpus Christi. Following the FBI's instructions, I expressed interest but asked for verification information. The caller provided a DOT number, a physical address, and a callback number, all of which the FBI had already confirmed were fake. "I can pick up the load in 4 hours," I told the caller, "but I'll need advance payment authorization and a signed contract." "No problem. The customer will provide cash payment on delivery, and we'll email you the contract within the hour." The contract arrived exactly on schedule, and it looked completely legitimate. Professional formatting, proper legal language, and accurate information about shipping regulations and liability coverage. But Agent Crawford and her team had identified dozens of subtle indicators that it was fraudulent. "They're getting better at creating convincing documentation," she explained during our final briefing at the FBI field office in Austin. "But they're still making small mistakes that trained investigators can detect." The surveillance operation was more extensive than I had expected. The FBI had positioned unmarked vehicles along my entire planned route, installed tracking devices in my truck that I couldn't detect, and established communication protocols that would allow them to monitor my status without interfering with the criminal operation. "Remember," Agent Crawford said, "your job is to act like a normal trucker accepting a routine load. Don't try to investigate anything yourself, don't take any unnecessary risks, and don't do anything that would tip them off to our surveillance." "What if they try to harm me?" "Our surveillance teams will intervene before that happens. We have snipers positioned at the pickup location, mobile units that will shadow you throughout the delivery, and tactical teams standing by at multiple locations." At 6 a.m., I drove to the pickup address, a warehouse complex in an industrial area southeast of Austin that looked exactly like dozens of other freight facilities I'd visited over the years. The loading crew was professional and efficient, and the cargo appeared to be exactly what the shipping documents described. But as I was signing the bills of lading, one of the workers made a comment that sent chills down my spine. "You look familiar," he said, studying my face carefully. "Haven't we met somewhere before?" "I don't think so," I replied, trying to sound casual. Well, maybe you just have one of those faces. A lot of truckers start to look alike after a while." The drive from Austin to Corpus Christi should have taken about 3.5 hours, but it felt like the longest journey of my trucking career.
Every mile was filled with tension, wondering if the next exit ramp would be where the criminals made their move, constantly checking my mirrors for signs of surveillance or pursuit. The FBI surveillance teams were invisible to me, which was both reassuring and unsettling. I knew they were there, but I couldn't see them, couldn't communicate with them directly, and couldn't be certain they would be able to help if something went wrong quickly. About an hour into the trip, my CB radio started picking up strange transmissions, not the usual trucker chatter, but coded conversations that sounded like operational communications between coordinated teams. Package is moving on schedule toward Destination Alpha. All units maintain distance and visual contact. Backup team standing by at Checkpoint Bravo. The language was too professional for normal criminal operations, too military in its precision and terminology. It made me wonder if I was caught in the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple cargo theft operation. Near Victoria, I stopped for fuel and a mandatory rest break. While I was stretching my legs and checking my trailer, a man approached me from a pickup truck that had been parked at the diesel pumps when I arrived. "You Buck Williams?" he asked. He was middle-aged, wearing work clothes that looked like they belonged on a construction site or oil field. Nothing obviously threatening about him, but something in his eyes made me cautious. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Pete Hawkins. I drive for Gulf Coast Transport. Been hearing some things on the CB about drivers going missing on runs like yours." "What kind of things?" Pete looked around the truck stop carefully before continuing. "Drivers accepting high-paying loads with unusual pickup locations, loads that don't match the cargo descriptions, deliveries to facilities that turn out to be abandoned or fake." "You think this load is suspicious?" "I think any load that pays triple rates for routine cargo is worth questioning, especially when it involves drivers who've had previous encounters with fake shipping companies." That stopped me cold. "How do you know about my previous encounter?" "Word gets around in the trucking community. Buck Williams, the driver who escaped from a fake biological research operation and helped expose a criminal network. You're kind of famous among independent operators." Pete pulled out a business card and handed it to me. "If something goes wrong with your delivery, call this number. We got a network of drivers who look out for each other, and we can get help to you faster than law enforcement in most situations." As I climbed back into my truck, I noticed that Pete's pickup had disappeared. But in my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of what might have been an FBI surveillance vehicle adjusting its position in the truck stop parking lot. The delivery address in Corpus Christi turned out to be a legitimate chemical processing facility, but something felt wrong from the moment I arrived at the security gate. The guard who checked my paperwork seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder toward the main building, and took much longer than necessary to verify my delivery authorization. "You'll want to go to Dock 17, he said finally. "Just follow the signs and someone will meet you there." The chemical plant was massive. Hundreds of acres of processing towers, storage tanks, and industrial equipment connected by a maze of roads and pipelines. Finding Dock 17 required following a series of increasingly confusing directional signs that led me deeper into the complex. When I finally reached the designated loading dock, I found something that immediately triggered all my danger instincts. The area was completely deserted. No workers, no equipment, no other vehicles. Just an empty loading dock with a roll-up door that was standing open to reveal a dark, empty building interior. I set my brakes and climbed down from my cab to investigate, but I kept my CB radio in hand and my truck running in case I needed to leave quickly. "Hello?" I called out toward the open loading dock. "Anybody here?" A man emerged from the shadows inside the building. He was wearing a business suit instead of work clothes, and he moved with the kind of careful precision that suggested military or law enforcement training. "Mr. Williams, thank you for making the delivery on schedule. We'll have you unloaded and on your way shortly." "Where's your unloading crew?"
They're being briefed on the specialized handling requirements for your cargo. Industrial cleaning equipment requires certain safety precautions. Something about his answer bothered me. The cargo I'd loaded was standard pump and valve components, not specialized cleaning equipment. Either the man had been given incorrect information about my load, or someone was deliberately providing false information. "I'll need to see some identification," I said. "Company policy for deliveries to new customers." The man reached into his jacket, but instead of producing identification, he pulled out what appeared to be a small electronic device that he pointed in my direction. "Mr. Williams, I'm going to need you to step away from your truck and come with me into the building. There are some people who want to speak with you." That's when I noticed that other men had emerged from various locations around the loading dock area. All of them were wearing business suits. All of them appeared to be armed, and all of them were positioned to prevent me from returning to my truck. I was surrounded. I had two choices: comply with the armed men and hope the FBI surveillance teams would intervene, or make a run for my truck and try to escape on my own. Given that I was surrounded by what appeared to be trained professionals, running didn't seem like a viable option. "I don't know what this is about," I said, raising my hands to show I wasn't reaching for a weapon. "But I'm just a trucker making a delivery." The man with the electronic device smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Mr. Williams, we know exactly who you are and what you've been doing. You're the driver who disrupted our Austin operation 8 months ago. You've been working with federal agents to investigate our activities, and you've been helping other truckers avoid our recruitment efforts." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with us voluntarily, or whether we're going to have to use more persuasive methods." One of the other men approached my truck and began examining the cargo area. "Vehicle's clean," he called out. "Standard industrial equipment, nothing suspicious." "That's because the cargo isn't the point," the leader said. "The point is the driver. Mr. Williams has information we need, and he's going to provide it one way or another." I could hear vehicles approaching from various directions around the chemical plant. Either the FBI surveillance teams were moving into position, or more criminals were arriving to participate in whatever they had planned for me. "What kind of information?" "Details about the truckers who've been working with law enforcement. Names, routes, communication methods. You're going to help us identify every driver who's been interfering with our operations." The approaching vehicle sounds were getting closer, but I couldn't tell if they represented help or additional danger. The men surrounding me were becoming more tense and alert, suggesting they were aware of the approaching vehicles and weren't sure if they were friendly or hostile. "I can't give you information about other drivers," I said. "Even if I wanted to, I don't know their personal details." "We'll see about that." The leader reached into his jacket again, but this time he pulled out what appeared to be a syringe filled with some kind of clear liquid. "This will make you much more cooperative. It's a chemical compound that inhibits the brain's ability to resist questioning while maintaining consciousness and memory formation. You'll tell us everything we want to know, and you'll remember doing it." That's when the first FBI tactical vehicle crashed through the fence surrounding the loading dock area. The next few minutes were chaos. FBI tactical teams swarmed the loading dock from multiple directions, shouting commands and taking positions behind vehicles and industrial equipment. The criminals scattered, some running toward buildings inside the chemical plant, others attempting to reach vehicles that were parked in various locations around the facility. The leader with the syringe grabbed my arm and used me as a human shield while backing toward the open loading dock door. "Federal agents, stay back or the driver dies," he shouted. "Let him go and put down your weapon," came the amplified voice of what sounded like Agent Crawford using a bullhorn from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence. "We want safe passage out of the facility and a 1-hour head start before any pursuit." "That's not going to happen. Release the driver and surrender peacefully." The man holding me was breathing heavily and sweating despite the cool February air. Whatever his original plan had been, it clearly hadn't included dealing with a full FBI tactical response, and he was improvising under extreme stress. "How did they know?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. The operation was completely compartmentalized. That's when I realized that the FBI had been tracking more than just my movements. They had somehow infiltrated the criminal organization's communications and had known about the trap at the chemical plant before I arrived. The tactical standoff continued for several more minutes, with FBI agents gradually tightening the perimeter around the loading dock while the criminals tried to find escape routes through the maze of industrial buildings. But it was clear that the facility had been surrounded and that there was no way out. "Last chance!" Agent Crawford's voice boomed across the area. "Surrender now, or we start using non-lethal force to end this standoff." The man holding me made his decision. He released his grip on my arm and threw the syringe as far away as possible. "I surrender. Don't shoot." Within seconds, FBI tactical agents had secured all the criminals and were beginning the process of searching the area for evidence. Agent Crawford approached me with a mixture of relief and concern. "Buck, are you injured?" "I'm fine, but that was a lot closer than I was comfortable with. We had snipers positioned with clear shots the entire time. You were never in real danger." "What about the chemical plant? Are the regular employees safe?" "This isn't a real chemical plant. It's a facility that was abandoned 3 years ago and has been used as a front for criminal operations. The entire complex is empty except for the people we just arrested." That explained why the facility had felt wrong from the moment I arrived. It wasn't an active industrial site. It was an elaborate movie set designed to create the illusion of legitimate business activity. The arrests at the fake chemical plant led to the discovery of a criminal organization that was far more sophisticated and extensive than anyone had realized. The FBI's investigation revealed a network that operated across multiple states and was involved in activities that went well beyond trucking industry manipulation. "What we've uncovered is essentially a shadow transportation company," Director Martinez explained during the debriefing session at the FBI field office in Houston. "They've been using legitimate truckers to move illegal cargo, kidnapping drivers to steal their identities, and infiltrating trucking companies to gain access to transportation networks." The evidence collected from the fake chemical plant included detailed files on over 300 truckers who had been targeted for recruitment or elimination. The files contained personal information, financial records, family details, and operational assessments that demonstrated a level of surveillance and planning that was truly frightening. "They knew everything about the drivers they targeted," Agent Crawford said. "Home addresses, family members, financial situations, driving records, even personal habits and psychological profiles." My own file was 6 pages long and included information that I had never shared with anyone, including details about my divorce, my daughter's college expenses, and even my preferred routes and rest stops. The criminals had been watching me for months before my original encounter with the fake biological research cargo. How did they gather this much information? Multiple sources. Hacked computer systems, corrupt employees in trucking companies and government agencies, private investigators, and electronic surveillance of drivers' personal communications. The 3 missing Richardson freight drivers, Jerry Hoskins, Danny Crenshaw, and Carl Morrison, were found alive but in serious condition at a remote facility near the Texas-Louisiana border. They had been held captive while the criminal organization used their identities to infiltrate other trucking operations. All 3 drivers were drugged and subjected to intensive interrogation about trucking industry operations, Director Martinez explained. They were forced to provide detailed information about routes, procedures, contacts, and security measures. The facility where they were held contained equipment for creating fake identification documents, plastic surgery facilities for altering appearance, and what appeared to be a training center where criminals learned to impersonate legitimate truck drivers. This was industrial-scale identity theft, Agent Crawford said. They were literally stealing people's lives and using them to commit crimes. The federal investigation ultimately resulted in the arrest of 47 individuals across 7 states and the seizure of millions of dollars in assets,
equipment, and illegal cargo. The criminal organization had been operating for over 5 years and was responsible for dozens of driver disappearances, hundreds of cargo thefts, and the transportation of everything from illegal drugs to human trafficking victims. Jerry, Danny, and Carl required months of medical treatment and psychological counseling to recover from their captivity, but all three eventually returned to driving. Their experiences had been traumatic, but they were determined not to let the criminals destroy their careers and livelihoods. "They tried to steal who we are," Jerry told me when we met at a truck stop in Dallas 6 months after his rescue. "But they couldn't take away the fact that we're truckers. This is what we do. This is who we are, and no criminal organization is going to change that." The trucking industry implemented new security measures as a result of the investigation, including better verification procedures for dispatch calls, enhanced background checks for employees with access to driver information, and improved communication protocols for reporting suspicious activities. The Roadwatch network that I had helped establish was formally recognized by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies as a valuable resource for combating freight-related crime. We now work directly with federal investigators to identify emerging threats and provide early warnings about suspicious activities. But perhaps the most important outcome of the entire experience was the demonstration that the American trucking community could successfully resist criminal infiltration when drivers worked together and supported each other. "What you drivers accomplished through your network was remarkable," Director Martinez said during the final case briefing. "You identified threats that formal law enforcement might have missed, you protected each other from criminal exploitation, and you provided crucial assistance in dismantling a major criminal organization." The monetary rewards for participating in the investigation were substantial. The FBI paid significant consultation fees, and there were federal rewards for information leading to arrests and convictions. But the real reward was knowing that other drivers would be safer because we had been willing to take risks and work together. 2 years have passed since that February night when I walked into a trap at a fake chemical plant in Corpus Christi. I'm still driving trucks across Texas and the surrounding states, still moving freight from point A to point B, still listening to CB radio chatter about weather, traffic, and truck stop food. But everything is different now. Every load I accept is thoroughly verified through multiple channels. Every dispatcher call is confirmed independently. Every pickup and delivery location is researched in advance. The casual trust that once characterized the trucking industry has been replaced by vigilant caution and systematic verification. The Roadwatch network has grown to over 800 members across 23 states. We maintain secure communications channels, share real-time information about suspicious activities, and provide support for drivers who encounter dangerous situations. Law enforcement agencies now consider us an integral part of their efforts to combat transportation-related crime. We've prevented dozens of drivers from being victimized by criminal organizations, helped law enforcement investigate numerous cases of freight-related crime, and contributed to the successful prosecution of criminals who prey on the trucking industry. But there are still dangers out there. Criminal organizations continue to adapt and evolve, developing new techniques for exploiting drivers and transportation networks. They've become more sophisticated in their methods, more careful about security, and more ruthless in their treatment of anyone who interferes with their operations. Every week, I receive reports from Roadwatch members about suspicious load offers, fake companies, and drivers who have disappeared under circumstances that suggest criminal activity. The problem hasn't been solved. It's just become more complex and challenging. Yet there's something profoundly reassuring about the response of the trucking community to these threats. Drivers who might never meet face-to-face, but who share the common bond of life on the road, have created a network of mutual support and protection that spans the entire continent. When I'm driving through Texas in the late-night hours, listening to the familiar voices on Channel 19 and watching the endless stream of headlights that represent America's freight transportation system, I know that I'm part of something larger and more important than any individual load or delivery. I'm part of a community of professional drivers who have learned that our greatest strength isn't our individual skills behind the wheel, but our willingness to look out for each other and stand together against those who would exploit our industry and endanger our lives. The highway ahead may contain dangers that most people never imagine, but it's illuminated by the collective wisdom and mutual support of drivers who understand that we're all in this together. And on those long Texas nights when the CB radio crackles with warnings about speed traps, weather conditions, or suspicious activity ahead, I know that the voice on the other end of that radio might be saving my life, just as I might be saving theirs. The road is only as dark as we allow it to be, and the American trucking community has chosen to keep it well lit. The scorching July sun was already beating down mercilessly at 7:30 a.m. when 22-year-old Miguel Santos pulled his rented Freightliner into the Petro truck stop in Laredo, Texas. Fresh out of CDL school with barely 3 months of over-the-road experience, Miguel was about to tackle his first solo run deep into the heart of West Texas, a route that veteran drivers had warned him about but never fully explained why. Miguel had grown up in San Antonio, the youngest son of a family that had worked in construction for 3 generations. But after watching his father's body break down from years of manual labor, Miguel decided that trucking offered a better path to financial stability. The pay was decent, the work was independent, and he could see the country while making a living. His dispatcher at Rio Grande Transport, a gruff man named Bobby Hutchins, had offered him what seemed like a straightforward job: deliver construction equipment from Laredo to an oil field service company near Sanderson, Texas, then pick up a load of drilling pipe for the return trip to Houston. The total run would cover about 600 miles of mostly empty highway through some of the most remote country in the continental United States. "Kid, you sure you're ready for the Big Bend run?" Bobby had asked that morning. "That's serious desert country out there. No cell towers, no truck stops for 100 miles at a stretch, and temperatures that can kill you if your rig breaks down." "I've studied the route," Miguel had replied with the confidence of youth. "I-35 north to San Antonio, then west on I-10 to Junction, then south on 377 to Sanderson. Should take about 8 hours. Bobby had looked at him with the expression of a man who knew things that couldn't be taught in driving school. "Miguel, listen to me real careful. You stick to the main highways. Don't take any shortcuts. Don't trust your GPS if it tries to route you through back roads, and don't stop to help anybody until you're back in civilization." "What do you mean, don't help anybody?" "I mean exactly that. You see a broken down car, a hitchhiker, even another trucker claiming he needs assistance. You keep driving and call the state police from the next town. That country between Sanderson and Del Rio has swallowed up more travelers than you'd believe." Miguel had nodded and promised to follow Bobby's advice, but in his inexperience he didn't understand the deadly seriousness behind the warning. He was about to learn that the vast emptiness of Southwest Texas could be more dangerous than any urban ghetto. By 10 a.m., Miguel was rolling west on Interstate 10 through the hill country around Kerrville, and the landscape was already becoming noticeably more arid and desolate. The rolling hills covered with oak and mesquite were giving way to flatter, more barren terrain dotted with prickly pear cactus and scrub brush. His load consisted of 3 pieces of heavy earth-moving equipment: bulldozer blades, hydraulic excavator arms, and steel support beams, all destined for Apex Oil Field services in Sanderson. The cargo was properly secured with heavy-duty chains and load binders, and Miguel had conducted thorough pre-trip inspections that morning to ensure his truck was in perfect mechanical condition. The CB radio carried the usual chatter from other drivers discussing fuel prices, construction zones, and road conditions ahead. Miguel listened to the conversations with interest, still learning the informal network of information sharing that kept professional truckers informed about hazards and opportunities along their routes. "Westbound driver approaching junction," came a voice with a distinctive East Texas drawl. "Be advised there's a construction backup on I-10 about 15 miles past town. They got traffic down to one lane, and it's moving about as fast as molasses in January." Miguel keyed his microphone to respond. "Thanks for the heads up, driver. This is Rio Grande Transport, first time through this area. How long is the delay?" "Could be 30 minutes, could be 2 hours. They're doing some kind of bridge work and the pilot car ain't been running on schedule. You might want to consider the alternate route through Rock Springs if you're in a hurry." The suggestion of an alternate route intrigued Miguel. His delivery wasn't scheduled until 6 p.m., but avoiding a potentially long construction delay would give him more time to rest before beginning the return trip. He pulled out his road atlas and studied the network of state highways that crisscrossed the region. According to the map, he could take State Highway 41 south from Junction to State Highway 377, which would reconnect with his planned route near Sanderson. The alternate route would add about 40 miles to his trip, but it would avoid the construction zone entirely and take him through some interesting ranch country that he'd never seen before. Miguel made what he thought was a logical decision. When he reached Junction, instead of continuing west on I-10 toward the construction delay, he turned south onto Highway 41 toward Rock Springs. It was a decision that would nearly cost him his life. State Highway 41 south of Junction was a well-maintained 2-lane road that wound through some of the most beautiful and isolated ranch country in Texas. For the first 30 miles, Miguel enjoyed the scenery. Rolling hills covered with live oak trees, crystal-clear creeks running through limestone valleys, and the occasional ranch headquarters visible in the distance. The road carried very little traffic. In the first hour, Miguel encountered maybe a dozen vehicles, a few pickup trucks driven by ranchers, a couple of RVs with out-of-state plates, and one other semi-truck heading north toward Junction. The lack of congestion was a pleasant change from the busy interstates he was accustomed to driving. Miguel's CB radio picked up occasional transmissions from other truckers on I-10, but the signals became weaker as he traveled farther from the main highway corridor. By the time he reached Rock Springs, the radio was mostly quiet, except for local ranch traffic and the occasional long-distance skip signal from truckers hundreds of miles away. Rock Springs was a small ranching community with a population of maybe 1,500 people, consisting of a few businesses clustered around the courthouse square and residential streets lined with modest homes. Miguel stopped at a combination gas station and convenience store to fuel up and grab a cold drink, taking advantage of the opportunity to stretch his legs and check his cargo. The store clerk, an elderly man with skin weathered by decades of West Texas sun, studied Miguel's truck with interest. "Don't see many big rigs coming through town on 41, the clerk said. "Most of the truckers stick to the interstate." "Avoiding construction delays on I-10, Miguel explained. "GPS shows that 377 south will take me right where I need to go." The clerk's expression changed, and he looked at Miguel with something that might have been concern. "Son, you be real careful on 377 once you get past the turnoff to Camp Wood. That's some of the emptiest country in Texas, and there ain't much between here and Sanderson except rocks and rattlesnakes." "How far is it?" "About 120 miles of 2-lane highway through the middle of nowhere. No cell phone service, no gas stations, and if your truck breaks down, you could be waiting a long time for help." Miguel thanked the clerk for the advice and consulted his road atlas again. The route looked straightforward enough. 377 south through the ranch country, then east to connect with US 90 just north of Sanderson. The atlas showed several small communities along the way, which suggested that the road was well traveled enough to be safe. What Miguel didn't know was that several of those communities marked on his atlas no longer existed, and the road he was planning to travel had a reputation among locals as one of the most dangerous stretches of highway in southwest Texas. The first 50 miles of State Highway 377 south of Rock Springs were uneventful, but increasingly desolate. The rolling ranch country gradually flattened into more typical desert terrain, with mesquite and prickly pear cactus replacing the oak trees of the hill country. The temperature was climbing toward 105 degrees, and heat mirages were beginning to shimmer on the asphalt ahead. Miguel hadn't encountered another vehicle in over an hour when he came upon a historical marker at a scenic overlook that caught his attention. He pulled over to read the marker, which provided information about the geological formation known as Dead Man's Canyon. According to the historical marker, Dead Man's Canyon got its name from a series of deadly incidents that occurred in the area during the late 1800s. Stagecoach robberies, Apache raids, and travelers who simply disappeared in the harsh desert environment had given the canyon a reputation for danger that persisted into modern times. The marker also noted that the area was prone to flash flooding during rare but intense thunderstorms, and that several motorists had been killed over the years when they attempted to cross flooded low-water crossings. Miguel studied the landscape around the overlook and could see why the area had such a dangerous reputation. The highway descended into a narrow canyon with steep limestone walls on both sides, creating a natural trap where travelers could be easily ambushed or caught in rising water. But on this clear July afternoon, with no clouds in sight and the creek bed below completely dry, the canyon looked more beautiful than threatening. Miguel took a few photos with his phone, planning to share them with his girlfriend back in San Antonio, then climbed back into his truck to continue the journey. As he descended into Dead Man's Canyon, Miguel noticed that his cell phone signal had disappeared entirely. The high canyon walls apparently blocked reception, which meant he would be completely out of communication until he reached higher ground on the other side. That's when he saw the roadblock. About halfway through Dead Man's Canyon, where the highway was flanked by sheer limestone cliffs on both sides, Miguel encountered what appeared to be a legitimate road construction setup. Orange barrels and warning signs directed traffic into a single lane, and a flagman wearing a hard hat and safety vest was standing in the road with a stop sign. Miguel brought his truck to a halt and waited for the flagman to direct him through the construction zone. But something about the setup didn't look right. There was no construction equipment visible, no workers, and no actual road work being performed. The flagman was alone, standing in the middle of an empty highway with no apparent purpose. The flagman approached Miguel's truck and motioned for him to roll down his window. "Afternoon, driver," the flagman said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Mexican. "We got a chemical spill up ahead that's going to take a while to clean up. You can either wait here for about 2 hours, or I can direct you to a detour that'll get you around the problem." Miguel studied the man more carefully. He appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair and a thin build. His safety equipment looked authentic, but his work boots were scuffed and worn in a way that suggested he'd been wearing them for activities other than highway construction. "What kind of chemical spill?" Miguel asked. "Tanker truck carrying cleaning solvents jackknifed about 3 miles ahead. Hazmat teams working on containment, but they got the road completely blocked. The detour will add maybe 20 miles to your trip, but you'll avoid the delay." Miguel consulted his road atlas and saw that there were indeed several ranch roads in the area that could theoretically provide an alternate route. But the roads weren't clearly marked on the map, and they appeared to wind through very remote country. "How well marked is this detour?" Miguel asked. "Real well marked. We put up signs every quarter mile to keep folks from getting lost. It's a good gravel road that connects back to 377 about 15 miles south of here." The flagman's explanation sounded plausible, and Miguel was eager to stay on schedule for his delivery. But something in the back of his mind was nagging at him, a memory of Bobby Hutchins' warning about not trusting strangers in the remote country. "Tell you what," Miguel said. "I think I'll just wait here for the hazmat team to finish their work." The flagman's expression changed subtly. and Miguel caught a glimpse of something that might have been frustration or anger. "Suit yourself, driver, but like I said, it's gonna be a long wait." As the flagman walked back toward the construction barrels, Miguel noticed two things that made his blood run cold. First, the man had a small radio clipped to his belt, and he appeared to be speaking into it in a low voice. Second, there was a pickup truck parked behind some rocks about 100 yards ahead, partially concealed but visible from Miguel's elevated position in his cab. Miguel was beginning to realize that he had driven into a trap. Miguel sat in his truck for about 10 minutes, watching the flagman and trying to decide what to do. During that time, he observed several details that confirmed his suspicions about the legitimacy of the road construction setup. The construction barrels and signs were authentic highway department equipment, but they were old and faded, as if they had been stolen from a legitimate job site months earlier. The flagman kept glancing toward the concealed pickup truck and speaking into his radio, but Miguel never heard any response transmissions. Most tellingly, there was no evidence of any actual roadwork or chemical spill. The highway ahead looked completely normal, and Miguel could see for over a mile in the clear desert air. There was no emergency equipment, no hazmat vehicles, and no signs of any incident. Miguel made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of waiting for the flagman to direct him through the fake construction zone, he put his truck in reverse and began backing up the highway toward the canyon entrance. The flagman immediately became agitated and ran toward Miguel's truck, waving his stop sign and shouting something that Miguel couldn't hear clearly. But Miguel kept backing up, using his mirrors to navigate the narrow highway while maintaining visual contact with the flagman and the concealed pickup truck. That's when the pickup truck emerged from its hiding place and began following Miguel up the canyon. The truck contained at least 2 men, and Miguel could see that they were talking on radios, apparently coordinating with other units that Miguel hadn't yet spotted. Miguel reached a spot where the canyon widened enough for him to turn his truck around, and he quickly executed a Y-turn that got him pointed back toward Rock Springs. As he accelerated out of the canyon, he could see in his mirrors that the pickup truck was giving chase, along with another vehicle that had apparently been positioned at the canyon entrance. Miguel grabbed his CB radio and began broadcasting on the emergency channel, hoping to reach another trucker or law enforcement officer. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Rio Grande Transport on State Highway 377 at Dead Man's Canyon. I'm being pursued by multiple vehicles after encountering a fake road construction setup. Requesting immediate assistance." The only response was static. Miguel was too far from any major highway to reach other truckers, and the canyon walls were blocking his radio transmissions from reaching very far. Miguel pushed his heavily loaded truck as hard as he dared on the winding 2-lane highway, but the pickup trucks pursuing him were much faster and more maneuverable. They were gaining on him rapidly, and Miguel could see that the occupants appeared to be armed. The chase through the remote ranch country of southwest Texas was unlike anything Miguel had experienced in his 3 months of trucking. His Freightliner, loaded with 45,000 pounds of construction equipment, was capable of maybe 65 miles on the flat stretches of highway, while the pickup trucks chasing him could easily exceed 90 miles per hour. Miguel's only advantage was his knowledge of defensive driving techniques and the superior braking capability of his truck's air brake system. On the curves and hills, he could maintain higher speeds than his pursuers might expect, and he could use engine braking to control his speed without revealing his intentions through brake lights. The chase continued for nearly 30 miles through some of the most desolate country in Texas. Miguel passed abandoned ranch houses, dried-up windmills, and fence lines that stretched to the horizon without any signs of current habitation. If his truck broke down, or if he was forced off the road, it could be days before anyone found him. Miguel's CB radio occasionally picked up distant transmissions from truckers on I-10, but he was too far away for them to hear his emergency calls clearly. The static-filled broadcasts were frustrating reminders of how isolated he was in this empty landscape. Around 3 p.m., with his fuel gauge showing less than a quarter tank and the temperature outside approaching 110 degrees, Miguel crested a hill and saw something that gave him hope. A Texas Department of Public Safety checkpoint, about 2 miles ahead. The checkpoint appeared to be a routine inspection station where state troopers were examining commercial vehicles for compliance with safety regulations. Miguel could see several big rigs parked at the facility and uniformed officers conducting inspections. Miguel keyed his CB radio and tried once more to broadcast an emergency message. Any unit. This is Rio Grande Transport approaching the DPS checkpoint on 377. I'm being pursued by armed subjects and need immediate assistance. This time, he received a response. Rio Grande Transport. This is DPS Unit 47 at the inspection station. We copy your transmission. Proceed directly to our location and we'll provide assistance. Miguel felt a wave of relief wash over him. The nightmare chase was about to end, and the men pursuing him would have to break off their attack rather than confront law enforcement officers. But as Miguel approached the checkpoint, he began to notice details that suggested something was very wrong. The Texas DPS checkpoint looked authentic from a distance, complete with official vehicles, uniformed officers, and the proper signage for a commercial vehicle inspection station. But as Miguel got closer, he began to see inconsistencies that made him question whether he was approaching genuine law enforcement. The patrol cars were the right make and model, but they were older units with faded paint and mismatched equipment. The uniforms worn by the officers were close to regulation, but the badges and patches looked slightly wrong, like good imitations rather than authentic department-issued gear. Most troubling was the fact that the checkpoint was located in the middle of nowhere, at least 50 miles from the nearest town. Miguel had never heard of DPS operating inspection stations in such remote locations, especially with no apparent logistical support or backup facilities. Miguel slowed his truck as he approached the checkpoint, but instead of stopping, he kept rolling at about 10 mph while studying the setup more carefully. That's when he noticed that none of the big rigs parked at the facility had drivers visible in or around the trucks. The vehicles were empty, abandoned, with their doors standing open and personal belongings scattered on the ground. One of the fake officers approached Miguel's truck and motioned for him to pull over. "Driver, we need to conduct a mandatory inspection of your vehicle and cargo. Pull into Bay 3 and shut down your engine." Miguel didn't comply. Instead, he keyed his CB radio and tried to reach real law enforcement. Any DPS unit. This is Rio Grande Transport requesting verification of a checkpoint on Highway 377. I'm encountering suspicious activity and need confirmation. The fake officer became more insistent, placing his hand on what appeared to be a sidearm. "Driver, you are required by state law to comply with this inspection. Failure to stop will result in serious criminal charges." Miguel made a split-second decision. He floored the accelerator and drove straight through the checkpoint, ignoring the shouts from the fake officers and the sound of what might have been gunshots behind him. As he cleared the checkpoint and continued south on Highway 377, Miguel could see in his mirrors that several vehicles were now in pursuit, not just the original pickup trucks, but also the fake patrol cars from the checkpoint. Miguel was beginning to understand that he had stumbled into the middle of a sophisticated criminal operation that used fake road construction and law enforcement checkpoints to rob truckers traveling through remote areas of Texas. As Miguel fled from the fake DPS checkpoint, his CB radio began picking up transmissions that revealed the true scope of the criminal operation he had encountered. The pursuing vehicles were coordinating their activities using police-style radio procedures, discussing roadblocks, pursuit tactics, and what sounded like plans for disposing of Miguel and his truck. "Unit 3, this is base. Target vehicle is continuing south on 377 toward the Sanderson Junction. Move Units 7 and 8 to intercept at coordinate Bravo." "Base, this is Unit 7. We're in position at the low water crossing. Vehicle will have to slow down there and we can box him in." "Copy that. Unit 3, maintain pursuit but don't engage until he's stopped. We want the cargo intact and no damage to the truck. Miguel realized with growing horror that the criminals weren't just opportunistic robbers. They were an organized network that had been operating in the area for some time, using sophisticated equipment and tactics to prey on truckers traveling through remote areas. The radio transmissions also revealed that Miguel wasn't their first victim. The criminals discussed previous operations, mentioning trucks and drivers by company names and physical descriptions. They talked about processing vehicles and cargo, and about disposal sites in the desert where evidence could be permanently eliminated. Miguel's fuel gauge was approaching empty, and he knew that his heavily loaded truck was consuming diesel at a prodigious rate during the high-speed chase. He estimated that he had maybe 30 miles of range left, which meant he had to find help or refuge before his truck ran out of fuel in the middle of the desert. The landscape around Highway 377 was becoming increasingly barren as Miguel approached the junction with US 90 near Sanderson. The rolling hills were giving way to flatter desert, with fewer trees and less cover where a person might hide from pursuit. Miguel tried repeatedly to reach legitimate law enforcement on his CB radio, but his transmissions were either jammed by the criminals or simply not reaching any stations due to his remote location. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. He was alone in the desert with criminals closing in and no way to call for help. That's when Miguel remembered Bobby Hutchins' advice about sticking to main highways and not trusting GPS routing through back roads. He had violated both principles, and now he was paying the price for his inexperience and overconfidence. But Miguel also remembered something else from his CDL training, a lesson about using a truck's size and weight as defensive advantages when confronted by smaller, more agile vehicles. About 15 miles north of Sanderson, Highway 377 descended into a series of low water crossings where seasonal creeks cut through the road. During flash floods, these crossings could be deadly traps for unwary motorists. But during the current drought, they were simply dips in the road with concrete culverts carrying minimal water flow. Miguel could see that the criminals had positioned vehicles at the largest of these crossings, creating a roadblock that would force him to stop or attempt to drive around them through rough desert terrain that would probably bog down his heavy truck. As Miguel approached the roadblock, he made a decision that drew on both his training and his desperation. Instead of stopping or trying to evade the roadblock, he accelerated toward it, using his truck's superior weight and momentum as weapons against the lighter vehicles. Miguel's Freightliner, loaded with construction equipment and weighing over 78,000 pounds, struck the roadblock at approximately 45 mph. The pickup trucks and fake patrol cars that had been positioned to stop him were swept aside like toys, their occupants diving clear to avoid being crushed. The impact destroyed Miguel's front bumper and damaged his radiator, but his truck remained operational. Steam was beginning to rise from under the hood, indicating that his cooling system was compromised. But the engine was still running, and the truck was still moving. Miguel continued toward Sanderson, knowing that he had probably only minutes before his overheated engine seized up. Behind him, he could see that several of the criminal vehicles were damaged and out of action, but others were still in pursuit. The radio transmissions from the criminals had become more urgent and angry. They were discussing eliminating the witness and cleaning up the mess in terms that left no doubt about their intentions if they recaptured Miguel. Miguel's truck finally began to fail about 5 miles north of Sanderson. The engine temperature had climbed into the red zone, and he could smell burning oil and coolant. But ahead he could see the welcome sight of US Highway 90 and the outskirts of a real town with real law enforcement. Miguel managed to coax his dying truck to the intersection of Highway 377 and US 90, where he immediately spotted a genuine Texas Department of Public Safety patrol car parked at a convenience store. The officer was inside the store, apparently taking a break from patrol duties. Miguel pulled into the parking lot, set his brakes, and ran into the store shouting for help. The state trooper, Sergeant Linda Martinez immediately recognized that Miguel was in genuine distress and called for backup while taking his initial statement about the fake checkpoints and criminal network. Within an hour, the area was swarming with law enforcement officers from multiple agencies, but the criminals had apparently scattered into the vast desert when they realized that Miguel had reached safety and that their operation had been compromised. Sergeant Linda Martinez had been patrolling the remote highways of southwest Texas for 8 years, and she had seen enough to know that Miguel's story was both credible and deeply disturbing. The existence of organized criminal networks preying on truckers in remote areas was a persistent problem that law enforcement agencies had been trying to address for years. "Son, you're lucky to be alive," Sergeant Martinez told Miguel as they sat in her patrol car outside the convenience store in Sanderson. "We've had reports of missing truckers in this area for the past 2 years, but we've never had a survivor who could give us detailed information about how these criminals operate." Miguel's truck was steaming in the parking lot, its damaged radiator leaking coolant onto the hot asphalt. The engine had finally seized up completely, but Miguel had managed to reach safety before the mechanical failure stranded him in the desert with his pursuers. Within 30 minutes of Miguel's arrival in Sanderson, the parking lot was filled with law enforcement vehicles. Texas Rangers, DEA agents, Border Patrol officers, and deputies from multiple county sheriff's departments had converged on the scene to coordinate a response to what was clearly a major criminal operation. Captain Robert Hayes of the Texas Rangers took charge of the investigation and immediately began organizing search teams to locate the fake checkpoints and roadblocks that Miguel had described. "We're dealing with a sophisticated criminal enterprise," Captain Hayes explained to Miguel during his formal debriefing. "These people have military-grade communications equipment, stolen law enforcement vehicles, and detailed knowledge of remote highway corridors that most legitimate officers don't even know exist." "How long have they been operating?" Miguel asked. "Based on missing person reports and unsolved cases, probably at least 3 years, maybe longer. The problem is that truckers who travel these remote routes often don't have regular check-in schedules, so when they disappear, it can be days or weeks before anyone reports them missing." Miguel learned that he was actually the 4th trucker in the past year to report encounters with fake law enforcement checkpoints in southwest Texas. The other 3 drivers had managed to avoid being captured, but they hadn't been able to provide law enforcement with enough detailed information to locate the criminals' base of operations. "What happens to the truckers who don't escape?" Miguel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Captain Hayes exchanged a look with Sergeant Martinez before responding. "We've found evidence of at least 6 commercial vehicles that were stripped for parts and abandoned in remote areas. The trucks were burned to destroy evidence, and the drivers..." He paused. "Let's just say we're treating this as a homicide investigation." The implications were chilling. Miguel had stumbled into the territory of criminals who were not just robbing truckers, but murdering them and disposing of their bodies in the vast emptiness of the desert. Over the next several hours, multiple law enforcement agencies launched a coordinated search of the area where Miguel had encountered the criminal network. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the desert for hidden vehicles and equipment, while ground teams followed Highway 377 looking for evidence of the fake checkpoints. Miguel accompanied one of the search teams, riding with Captain Hayes in an unmarked Texas Ranger vehicle. His first-hand knowledge of the locations and layouts of the criminal operations would be crucial for the investigation. When they reached Dead Man's Canyon, the fake construction zone had been completely removed. The orange barrels, warning signs, and other equipment had vanished, leaving no evidence that the roadblock had ever existed. Even the tire tracks from the vehicles had been carefully erased from the sandy shoulders of the highway. "These people are professionals," Captain Hayes observed. "They can set up and tear down their operations quickly, and they know how to eliminate evidence." The search team continued south to the location of the fake DPS checkpoint, but found only an empty patch of desert beside the highway. Again, All evidence of the criminal operation had been removed, leaving no traces for forensic investigators to analyze. However, one of the helicopter crews reported finding something significant about 10 miles east of Highway 377. A hidden compound in a remote canyon that contained multiple buildings, vehicles, and what appeared to be a truck dismantling operation. The compound was accessible only by a rough dirt road that wasn't marked on any map, and it was concealed from aerial observation by natural rock formations and carefully placed camouflage netting. The criminals had chosen their location well. It was virtually invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Captain Hayes coordinated a tactical approach to the compound with multiple agencies providing support. Border Patrol agents familiar with desert operations would approach from the south. DEA agents would cover the western approach, and Texas Rangers would assault the main entrance from the north. Miguel was positioned with the command post about 2 miles from the compound, where he could monitor radio communications and provide additional intelligence about the criminals he had encountered. The raid was scheduled for dawn the following morning, when the criminals would be least alert and the tactical teams would have the advantage of surprise. The pre-dawn raid on the criminal compound revealed the scope and sophistication of the operation that had been preying on truckers in southwest Texas. The facility contained multiple buildings, a vehicle maintenance shop, a communications center, and evidence of at least a dozen truck hijackings dating back several years. The main building served as a command center where the criminals coordinated their operations using stolen law enforcement radio equipment and detailed maps of remote highway corridors throughout Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. The walls were covered with photographs of trucks, routes, and potential targets, suggesting that the group had been systematically surveilling the trucking industry. The vehicle maintenance shop contained parts from numerous commercial trucks, engines, transmissions, and valuable components that had been stripped from hijacked vehicles. Many of the parts bore VIN numbers that matched missing trucks from law enforcement databases. Most disturbing was the discovery of a crematorium in one of the outbuildings, along with personal effects from missing truckers, wallets, identification documents, and CB radios that had belonged to drivers who had vanished in the area over the past several years. The tactical teams arrested 7 individuals at the compound, all of whom were armed and several of whom had extensive criminal records including charges for armed robbery, vehicle theft, and homicide. The leader of the group, a man named Carlos Mendoza, had previously served time for truck hijacking in California before apparently relocating to Texas. Captain Hayes briefed Miguel on the findings after the raid was completed. We found evidence linking this group to at least 12 missing truckers over the past 4 years. They were targeting drivers who traveled remote routes, using fake emergencies and law enforcement checkpoints to force trucks to stop in isolated areas. What happened to all those drivers? Miguel asked. Based on what we found at the compound, we believe they were murdered after the trucks were hijacked. The criminals were selling the cargo on the black market, stripping the trucks for parts, and eliminating witnesses who could identify them. Miguel felt sick thinking about how close he had come to sharing the fate of those other drivers. His decision to trust his instincts and flee from the fake checkpoint had literally saved his life. How did they choose their targets? Miguel asked. They monitored CB radio traffic and truck stop communications to identify drivers who were traveling alone on remote routes. They also had contacts at truck stops who would provide information about valuable loads and delivery schedules. The investigation revealed that the criminal network had connections throughout the trucking industry, with informants at truck stops, loading facilities, and even some trucking companies who would provide intelligence about high-value loads and vulnerable drivers. As federal investigators processed the evidence seized from the compound, a more disturbing picture emerged of the criminal network's operations and connections. The group hadn't been working alone. They were part of a larger organization that operated similar schemes throughout the southwestern United States. Agent Sarah Collins from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force arrived in Sanderson to coordinate the expanded investigation. She explained to Miguel that his escape had provided law enforcement with a crucial break in a multi-state investigation that had been ongoing for over 2 years. This group in Texas was just one cell of a much larger operation, Agent Collins explained. We've been tracking similar truck hijacking rings in Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada. They all use the same methods: fake emergencies, fraudulent law enforcement checkpoints, and carefully chosen remote locations. The evidence from the compound included communications with other criminal cells, revealing a network that stretched from California to Florida and involved hundreds of individuals in various support roles. The organization was structured like a business, with specialized teams handling different aspects of the operation. Some teams were responsible for surveillance and target selection, monitoring truck stops and highways to identify valuable loads and vulnerable drivers. Other teams handled the actual hijackings, using the fake checkpoint and emergency scenarios that Miguel had encountered. Still other teams were responsible for processing the stolen cargo and vehicles, operating chop shops and fencing operations that could quickly dispose of hijacked trucks and their contents. The criminal network had even infiltrated legitimate trucking companies and shipping facilities to facilitate their operations. The scope of this investigation is unprecedented, Agent Collins told Miguel. We're looking at potentially hundreds of missing truckers over the past decade, and cargo theft losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Miguel learned that his testimony would be crucial for prosecuting not just the individuals arrested at the compound, but the entire network of criminals who had been preying on the trucking industry. The information he had gathered during his escape, radio communications, vehicle descriptions, and operational details, was providing investigators with leads that extended across multiple states. But Agent Collins also warned Miguel that his cooperation with law enforcement had put him at risk from other members of the criminal network who were still at large. These people view witness elimination as just another business expense, Agent Collins explained. We're going to provide you with protective custody during the investigation and trial preparation. Miguel spent the next 3 weeks in a safe house operated by the U.S. Marshals Service, providing detailed testimony about his encounter with the criminal network and helping investigators understand the methods used by the truck hijacking ring. The safe house was a modest ranch-style home in a suburban neighborhood outside of San Antonio, staffed by federal agents who maintained 24-hour security while allowing Miguel to live in relative comfort while the investigation continued. During his time in protective custody, Miguel learned more about the scope of the criminal network and the impact his testimony was having on the investigation. Federal agents were making arrests in multiple states, seizing assets worth millions of dollars, and dismantling operations that had been stealing trucks and murdering drivers for years. The evidence gathered from Miguel's case had led to the identification of over 30 missing truckers whose disappearances were now linked to the criminal network. Recovery teams were searching remote areas throughout the Southwest for the remains of drivers who had been killed by the organization. Miguel also learned that his escape from Dead Man's Canyon had been even more fortunate than he had initially realized. The criminals had apparently planned to kill him at the fake DPS checkpoint, then dispose of his body at a location in the desert where other victims had been buried. You're the only trucker who's ever escaped from their operations once they identified you as a target, Agent Collins told Miguel during one of their interview sessions. Every other driver who encountered their checkpoints either avoided them completely or was captured and killed. The investigation also revealed that Miguel's employer, Rio Grande Transport, had unknowingly provided information to the criminal network about his delivery schedule and route. A dispatcher at the company, who had been arrested as part of the expanded investigation, had been selling information about valuable loads and driver schedules to criminal contacts for over a year. Bobby Hutchins, your dispatcher, wasn't involved in the criminal activity, Agent Collins assured Miguel. But someone else at your company was providing the criminals with intelligence about Rio Grande drivers and their loads. Miguel felt violated by the revelation that someone at his own company had been setting up drivers for robbery and murder. The trucking industry was supposed to be a community of professionals who looked out for each other, but the criminal network had corrupted that trust for their own profit. As the federal investigation expanded, Miguel found himself at the center of a complex legal proceeding that would involve testimony in multiple jurisdictions against dozens of defendants. The U.S. Attorney's Office was preparing what they described as the largest truck hijacking prosecution in American history. Miguel worked with federal prosecutors to prepare his testimony for what would be a series of trials extending over several months. His first-hand account of the criminal network's operations would be crucial for securing convictions against the key figures in the organization. Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Gonzalez, who was leading the prosecution team, explained to Miguel the importance of his testimony and the challenges they would face in court. The defense attorneys are going to try to discredit your account by claiming that you were confused, dehydrated, or hallucinating due to the stress of the situation, she warned Miguel. We need to make sure that every detail of your testimony is accurate and consistent. Miguel spent hours reviewing his account of the events, studying photographs of the defendants, and preparing for the aggressive cross-examination he would face from defense attorneys. The preparation was exhausting, but Miguel was determined to see justice done for the other truckers who hadn't been as fortunate as he had been. During the trial preparation, Miguel also learned more about the individual criminals who had been arrested. Carlos Mendoza, the leader of the Texas cell, had a history of violent crime dating back over 20 years, including previous convictions for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Several of the other defendants had military backgrounds and specialized knowledge of communications, weapons, and tactical operations that they had used to make their criminal activities more sophisticated and deadly. The criminal network had also corrupted law enforcement personnel in some areas, bribing local officers to ignore their activities and even providing advance warning of law enforcement operations. The investigation had led to the arrest of 3 police officers and a sheriff's deputy who had been working with the criminals. This case is going to send a message throughout the trucking industry that law enforcement takes these crimes seriously, Attorney Gonzalez told Miguel. Your courage in escaping from these criminals and cooperating with our investigation is going to help protect thousands of other drivers. But Miguel was also warned that the trial process would be lengthy and potentially dangerous. Some members of the criminal network were still at large, and there was concern that they might attempt to intimidate or harm witnesses who were cooperating with law enforcement. After 3 weeks in protective custody, Miguel was allowed to return to his normal life, though with ongoing security precautions and regular check-ins with federal agents. His truck had been repaired at government expense, and Rio Grande Transport had offered him a new position with better pay and more secure routes. But Miguel found that his experience with the criminal network had changed his perspective on trucking and his approach to the profession. The innocent confidence he had felt as a rookie driver was gone, replaced by a hard-earned awareness of the real dangers that existed on America's highways. Bobby Hutchins, his dispatcher at Rio Grande Transport, greeted Miguel's return with a mixture of relief and respect. The older man had heard about Miguel's ordeal through the trucking community's informal communication networks, and he was impressed by the young driver's survival skills and courage. Miguel, I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never heard of a driver who went through what you experienced and lived to tell about it, Bobby said. You've got the instincts and the backbone to be a successful trucker, but you also learned some hard lessons about the dangers that are out there. Miguel's first assignment after returning to work was a routine delivery from San Antonio to Dallas, a safe, well-traveled route on major highways with good communications coverage and plenty of law enforcement presence. It was a deliberate choice by the company to help Miguel regain his confidence gradually, but even on the familiar Interstate 35 corridor, Miguel found himself constantly checking his mirrors, monitoring his CB radio for unusual transmissions, and studying other vehicles for signs of suspicious behavior. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also potentially life-saving in a profession where complacency could be deadly. Miguel's experience had taught him to trust his instincts completely, to question situations that didn't feel right, and to always have an escape plan when traveling through remote areas. These were lessons that couldn't be taught in any CDL program, but they were essential skills for survival in the trucking industry. Other drivers at Rio Grande Transport began seeking out Miguel's advice about security and safety procedures. His reputation as a driver who had survived an encounter with organized criminals made him something of a legend in the local trucking community. 6 months after his escape from Dead Man's Canyon, Miguel found himself testifying in federal court in San Antonio as the government began its prosecution of the truck hijacking network. The courtroom was packed with law enforcement officers, media representatives, and family members of missing truckers who hoped that the trial would provide answers about their loved ones' disappearances. Miguel's testimony was detailed and compelling, walking the jury through every aspect of his encounter with the criminal network. He described the fake construction zone, the pursuit through the desert, and the false DPS checkpoint with a precision that impressed both prosecutors and defense attorneys. The defense strategy, as Attorney Gonzalez had predicted, was to attack Miguel's credibility and claim that he had misinterpreted innocent activities as criminal behavior. Defense attorneys suggested that Miguel had been confused by heat exhaustion, that he had panicked unnecessarily, and that the alleged criminals were actually legitimate road workers and law enforcement officers. But the physical evidence from the compound raid supported Miguel's testimony completely. The stolen truck parts, the personal effects from missing drivers, and the communications equipment used to coordinate the criminal operations corroborated every aspect of his account. Carlos Mendoza, the leader of the criminal network, was an intimidating figure who stared at Miguel throughout his testimony, apparently trying to frighten him into changing his story. But Miguel had faced down armed criminals in the desert, and he wasn't going to be intimidated by courtroom theatrics. During cross-examination, Mendoza's attorney tried to paint Miguel as an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by a desire for publicity and financial gain. But Miguel's calm, consistent responses and his obvious sincerity convinced the jury that he was telling the truth about his ordeal. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about the criminal network's operations, including testimony from other law enforcement officers about the discovery of mass grave sites in the desert where the remains of murdered truckers had been found. Federal agents testified about the scope of the investigation, the connections between the Texas cell and similar operations in other states, and the sophisticated methods used by the criminals to target and capture their victims. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of a ruthless criminal organization that viewed truck drivers as expendable resources to be exploited for profit. The casual brutality with which they had murdered their victims shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. The federal jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against Carlos Mendoza and his co-conspirators. The evidence presented during the trial had been overwhelming, and Miguel's testimony had been the crucial factor that tied together all aspects of the prosecution's case. Mendoza was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his role in organizing and leading the criminal network. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 25 to 50 years for their participation in the truck hijacking and murder conspiracy. The sentences sent a clear message throughout the criminal underworld that truck hijacking would be met with the full force of federal law enforcement. Similar prosecutions in other states resulted in additional convictions and lengthy prison sentences for criminals who had been preying on the trucking industry. Miguel attended the sentencing hearing and had the opportunity to address the court about the impact of his experience on his life and career. He spoke about the truckers who had been murdered by the criminal network, the families who had lost loved ones, and the need for continued vigilance to protect drivers who traveled remote highways. These criminals didn't just steal trucks and cargo, Miguel told the court. They attacked the foundation of trust that makes the trucking industry possible. They turned the professional courtesy that drivers show to each other into a weapon that they use to murder innocent people. Judge Patricia Williams, who presided over the trial, praised Miguel's courage in escaping from the criminals and cooperating with law enforcement. Mr. Santos, your actions in this case have undoubtedly saved the lives of other truck drivers who might have fallen victim to this criminal network. Your testimony has been instrumental in bringing these dangerous criminals to justice. The successful prosecution of the truck hijacking network led to changes in how law enforcement agencies approached transportation crime. New task forces were established to coordinate investigations across state lines, and federal funding was increased for operations targeting criminal networks that preyed on the trucking industry. Miguel's case also led to changes in trucking industry security practices. Companies began implementing better communication protocols for drivers traveling remote routes, and industry organizations developed training programs to help drivers recognize and avoid dangerous situations. But perhaps most importantly, Miguel's story became part of the informal knowledge that was passed down from experienced drivers to newcomers in the industry. His example of trusting his instincts and refusing to comply with suspicious authority figures became a model for how truckers should respond to potentially dangerous encounters. 2 years after his ordeal in Dead Man's Canyon, Miguel had established himself as one of Rio Grande Transport's most reliable and safety-conscious drivers. His experience with the criminal network had made him more cautious and aware, but it had also given him knowledge and instincts that made him valuable to his employer and respected by his peers. Miguel now worked as both a driver and a safety instructor, helping to train new drivers about the real dangers they might encounter on America's highways. His first-hand experience with criminal activity gave his safety presentations a credibility that couldn't be achieved through textbook learning alone. The most important lesson I learned, Miguel would tell new drivers during his safety presentations, is that your instincts are usually right. If something feels wrong about a situation, it probably is wrong. Don't let politeness or inexperience override your survival instincts. Miguel's route assignments had evolved to include some of the most challenging and potentially dangerous runs in the company's network. His proven ability to handle dangerous situations made him the driver of choice for high-value loads traveling through remote areas. But Miguel had also learned to appreciate the support network that existed within the trucking community. Experienced drivers who had heard about his encounter with the criminal network would often check on him via CB radio when they saw his truck on the highway, and truck stops along his regular routes kept track of his schedule to ensure that he arrived safely. The criminal network that had targeted Miguel was gone, but he knew that other dangerous individuals and organizations continued to prey on truckers. The vast emptiness of the American West would always attract criminals who wanted to operate beyond the reach of law enforcement, and truckers would always be vulnerable when traveling through remote areas. Miguel's advice to other drivers was simple but potentially life-saving. Stay alert, trust your instincts, maintain communications with other drivers and dispatchers, and never hesitate to flee from a situation that doesn't feel right. Being polite won't save your life, Miguel would conclude his safety presentations. But being smart and cautious will. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither do the criminals who operate out there. Miguel's experience in Dead Man's Canyon had transformed him from a naive rookie into a seasoned professional who understood the real dangers of his chosen career. But it had also reinforced his appreciation for the trucking industry and the community of drivers who shared the roads and looked out for each other. The highway ahead would always contain unknown dangers, but Miguel now had the knowledge and experience to recognize those dangers and respond appropriately. His survival had made him not just a better driver, but a guardian of the safety lessons that could protect other truckers from sharing the fate of those who had been less fortunate in their encounters with the criminals who haunted America's remote highways. 3 years after the successful prosecution of the Dead Man's Canyon criminal network, Miguel Santos had settled into what he thought would be a routine career as a senior driver and safety instructor at Rio Grande Transport. His reputation as a survivor and his expertise in security matters had made him one of the most respected drivers in the South Texas trucking community. But in late September 2026, a series of disturbing incidents began occurring on remote highways throughout Texas that bore an unsettling resemblance to the criminal methods Miguel had encountered years earlier. The first report came from a driver named Tommy Morrison, who had narrowly escaped what appeared to be a fake Border Patrol checkpoint on a back road near Eagle Pass. "It was just like what you described, Miguel," Tommy told him during a meeting at the Rio Grande terminal. "Professional-looking uniforms, authentic-seeming vehicles, but something felt wrong about the whole setup. When I asked to see their supervisor, they got nervous and let me go." Within a week, 3 more drivers reported similar encounters: fake emergency scenarios, suspicious checkpoints, and situations that didn't feel legitimate despite appearing official on the surface. All of the incidents occurred in remote areas of South and West Texas, away from major highways where help would be readily available. Miguel brought the reports to the attention of Agent Sarah Collins at the FBI, who had remained in contact with him since the original case. Agent Collins confirmed that federal law enforcement was aware of the new incidents and was concerned that copycat criminals were attempting to replicate the methods that had been so successful for the original network. "The problem with prosecuting a case as thoroughly as we did," Agent Collins explained to Miguel, "is that all the operational details become part of the public record. Other criminals can study the court transcripts and media reports to learn exactly how the original network operated." The new criminals appeared to be using many of the same techniques that had made the Dead Man's Canyon network so dangerous: remote locations, fake authority figures, sophisticated communications equipment, and detailed knowledge of trucking industry practices. But there were also differences that suggested the new group was learning from the mistakes that had led to the capture of the original network. They were more careful about leaving evidence, more sophisticated in their target selection, and more cautious about their operational security. Miguel realized that his survival story, which had been intended as a warning to help other drivers avoid dangerous situations, might also have served as an instruction manual for criminals who wanted to improve their own operations. Miguel's involvement in the original case and his current role as a safety instructor made him a valuable consultant for law enforcement agencies investigating the new criminal activity. But it also made him a potential target for criminals who viewed him as a threat to their operations. The first indication that Miguel was being targeted came in the form of surveillance that he noticed during his regular trucking runs. Vehicles that seemed to be following his truck at a distance, unfamiliar faces at truck stops who showed too much interest in his schedule, and radio transmissions that seemed to be monitoring his movements. Miguel's experience with the original criminal network had taught him to recognize signs of surveillance and potential threats. He immediately reported his concerns to Agent Collins and began taking additional security precautions during his routes. "They know who you are and what you represent," Agent Collins warned Miguel during a secure phone conversation. "You're the driver who escaped from their predecessors and helped put them in prison. That makes you both a symbol of law enforcement success and a personal enemy." Miguel's employer, Rio Grande Transport, hired a private security consultant to assess the threats against their most famous driver and to recommend protective measures. The consultant, a former military special operations officer named Jack Reynolds, was blunt about the level of danger Miguel faced. "These people view you as the reason their predecessors are spending life in prison," Reynolds explained. "They have every motivation to eliminate you, both for revenge and to prevent you from helping law enforcement again." Reynolds recommended a comprehensive security upgrade for Miguel's truck, including hidden GPS tracking devices, encrypted communication equipment, and defensive modifications that would help him escape if he was targeted for attack. Miguel also began varying his routes unpredictably, avoiding the remote highways where he had originally encountered criminal activity, and coordinating with law enforcement to report his location regularly during trips through potentially dangerous areas. But despite these precautions, Miguel couldn't avoid all contact with remote areas in his work as a professional trucker. The nature of the job required traveling through isolated regions where criminals could operate with relative impunity. Federal investigators studying the new criminal activity discovered that the copycat network was significantly more sophisticated than their predecessors. Instead of operating from a single compound, they used multiple temporary bases that could be quickly relocated if law enforcement discovered their location. The new criminals also had better connections within the trucking industry, with informants at truck stops, loading facilities, and even some shipping companies who provided information about valuable loads and driver schedules. Their target selection was more precise, focusing on high-value cargo and drivers who were traveling alone on predictable routes. Most concerning was their use of advanced technology to monitor law enforcement communications and track the movements of potential targets. They had access to equipment that could intercept radio transmissions, monitor GPS signals, and even hack into some trucking companies' dispatch systems. Miguel learned about these developments during briefings with federal agents who were coordinating the investigation into the new network. The sophistication of the criminal operation was far beyond what law enforcement had encountered in previous truck hijacking cases. They're operating more like an intelligence agency than a traditional criminal organization, Agent Collins explained. They have extensive surveillance capabilities, sophisticated operational security, and the resources to maintain multiple simultaneous operations across several states. The new network's methods also showed that they had learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. Instead of using easily identified fake law enforcement vehicles, they employed legitimate-looking civilian vehicles that could blend in with normal traffic. Instead of establishing permanent checkpoints, they used mobile operations that could be set up and removed quickly. Most disturbing was their apparent willingness to kill witnesses and law enforcement officers who interfered with their operations. Unlike the original network, which had primarily targeted truckers, the new criminals seemed prepared to escalate their violence against anyone who threatened their activities. Miguel realized that his expertise in recognizing and avoiding criminal operations might not be sufficient against opponents who were specifically studying his methods and adapting their tactics accordingly. The psychological pressure on Miguel intensified when the criminals began a deliberate campaign of harassment designed to frighten him and disrupt his normal life. They demonstrated that they knew his home address, his regular routes, and his personal schedule in ways that were clearly intended to intimidate him. Miguel began receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours, with callers who would hang up immediately or play recordings of radio transmissions from his original encounter with the Dead Man's Canyon network. The calls were traced to disposable cell phones that were discarded after each use, making them impossible to track back to their source. His truck was vandalized twice while parked at truck stops, with messages spray-painted on the trailer that referenced his testimony in the original criminal trials. The vandalism was carefully calculated to avoid causing mechanical damage that would strand him in dangerous locations, but to make it clear that the criminals could reach him anywhere. Most unsettling were the surveillance incidents where Miguel would spot the same vehicles or individuals at multiple locations along his routes, confirming that he was being systematically watched and his movements were being tracked by hostile forces. The psychological impact of being stalked by professional criminals was exhausting and stressful. Miguel found himself constantly checking his mirrors, avoiding his usual stops, and changing his routines in ways that made his job more difficult and less enjoyable. His wife, Maria, whom he had married 2 years after his original ordeal, was also affected by the harassment campaign. She received anonymous phone calls at their home, and their neighborhood was occasionally surveilled by vehicles with tinted windows and unknown occupants. "This has to stop," Maria told Miguel during one of their discussions about the ongoing threats.
These people are trying to destroy our lives, even though you did the right thing by helping law enforcement.
Miguel contacted Agent Collins about escalating the federal protection available to him and his family. But law enforcement resources were limited and the criminals were careful to avoid activities that would provide clear evidence of criminal behavior. The stalking campaign was designed to operate in the gray area between harassment and actual criminal activity, making it difficult for law enforcement to take decisive action while still achieving the goal of intimidating and isolating Miguel. In early December 2026, Miguel received what appeared to be a routine assignment from his dispatcher at Rio Grande Transport, a high-priority delivery of automotive parts from San Antonio to a manufacturing plant in Odessa. The load was valuable but not unusual, and the route was primarily on major highways through familiar territory. But as Miguel studied the shipping documents more carefully, he noticed several details that troubled him. The pickup location was a warehouse complex on the outskirts of San Antonio that he wasn't familiar with. The delivery was scheduled for late evening rather than normal business hours, and the customer contact information seemed incomplete. Miguel's experience with criminal networks had taught him to be suspicious of loads that deviated from normal patterns, especially when they involved unfamiliar facilities or unusual scheduling. He decided to conduct additional research before accepting the assignment. When Miguel called the supposed customer to confirm the delivery details, the phone number was answered by someone who claimed to be a supervisor but couldn't provide specific information about the manufacturing plant or the purpose of the delivery. The conversation felt scripted and artificial, like someone reading from prepared responses rather than discussing a legitimate business transaction. Miguel also discovered that the pickup location was a recently rented warehouse space that had no established business history and wasn't listed in any industry directories. The rental agreement was paid for with cash and registered to a company name that didn't exist in state business records. All of these factors suggested that the delivery assignment was not a legitimate business transaction, but rather an attempt to lure Miguel into a controlled situation where he could be attacked by the criminal network that had been stalking him. Miguel contacted Agent Collins and security consultant Jack Reynolds to discuss his suspicions about the suspicious assignment. Both professionals agreed that the load showed multiple indicators of being a trap designed to capture or eliminate Miguel. "This has all the hallmarks of a setup," Reynolds warned Miguel. "They're using your employer's legitimate dispatch system to create an assignment that appears routine but leads you into a situation they can control." The question was whether Miguel should avoid the assignment entirely or use it as an opportunity to help law enforcement locate and capture the criminals who had been harassing him for months. After extensive planning and coordination with federal law enforcement, Miguel decided to accept the suspicious delivery assignment as part of a counter-operation designed to capture the criminal network that had been targeting him. The plan would place him at considerable personal risk, but it offered the best opportunity to end the harassment campaign and bring the criminals to justice. Agent Collins coordinated the operation with multiple law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, DEA, Texas Rangers, and local sheriff's departments. Miguel would be equipped with tracking devices, communication equipment, and protective gear that would allow him to maintain contact with support teams while appearing to comply with the criminal's trap. Security consultant Jack Reynolds worked with federal agents to plan escape routes, contingency procedures, and tactical responses for various scenarios that the criminals might employ. The operation required careful coordination to protect Miguel while gathering evidence that could be used to prosecute the entire criminal network. "The key is to let them think they're in control while we actually maintain tactical advantage," Reynolds explained during the final planning session. "Miguel will appear to be following their script, but every move will be monitored and supported by our teams." Miguel's truck was equipped with hidden cameras, audio recording equipment, and GPS tracking devices that would document everything that occurred during the operation. Federal agents would be positioned along his route, ready to intervene if the situation became too dangerous. The plan called for Miguel to proceed to the pickup location, load whatever cargo the criminals provided, and follow their instructions until they revealed the full scope of their operation. At that point, law enforcement teams would move in to arrest the criminals and seize their assets. But everyone involved understood that the operation was extremely dangerous. The criminals had already demonstrated their willingness to kill truckers, and they would be especially motivated to eliminate Miguel given his role in destroying their predecessor network. Once this starts, there's no turning back, Agent Collins warned Miguel. These people will try to kill you if they realize you're working with law enforcement. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Miguel thought about all the truckers who had been murdered by the original network, the families who had lost loved ones, and the drivers who were still at risk from the new criminal organization. Someone has to stop them, Miguel replied, and I'm the one with the experience to recognize their methods and survive their attacks. On the designated morning, Miguel drove to the warehouse complex on the outskirts of San Antonio, where he was supposed to pick up the automotive parts delivery. The facility looked legitimate from the outside, a modern industrial building with proper signage and vehicle access. But Miguel's trained eye detected subtle signs that suggested it was being used for criminal purposes. The parking lot contained several vehicles that appeared to be surveillance units, with tinted windows and occupants who were monitoring the area rather than conducting normal business. The loading dock was staffed by individuals who looked more like security personnel than warehouse workers. Miguel backed his truck up to the designated loading dock and was met by a man who claimed to be the warehouse supervisor. The man was polite and professional, but Miguel could see that he was carrying a concealed weapon and was speaking into a radio earpiece that connected him to other members of his organization. "You must be Santos from Rio Grande Transport," the supervisor said. "We've got your load ready to go. Should take about an hour to get everything secured properly." The cargo being loaded into Miguel's trailer consisted of wooden crates that were supposedly filled with automotive parts, but the weight and handling characteristics suggested they contained something entirely different. The loading process was conducted by armed men who were clearly experienced in handling dangerous or illegal materials. During the loading process, Miguel noticed that additional vehicles had arrived at the warehouse complex, including several SUVs with tinted windows that appeared to be preparing for some kind of convoy operation. The criminals were apparently planning to escort his truck to whatever destination they had in mind. Miguel used his hidden communication equipment to alert the law enforcement teams that were monitoring the operation. "Package is loaded. Escorts are in position, about to begin the movement phase." He transmitted using coded language that had been established during the planning sessions. Agent Collins' voice came back through his concealed earpiece. "Copy that. Surveillance teams are in position along your route. Proceed with the operation, but be ready to abort if the situation becomes too dangerous." As Miguel signed the fraudulent shipping documents and prepared to leave the warehouse complex, the supervisor gave him detailed directions to his supposed delivery location, a remote industrial facility outside of Fredericksburg that Miguel was certain would be another trap designed to isolate him in a location where the criminals could operate without interference. "Drive carefully," the supervisor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We want to make sure this valuable cargo reaches its destination safely." Miguel's journey from San Antonio toward Fredericksburg was unlike any delivery run he had ever made. Instead of traveling alone, he was part of a convoy that included 3 SUVs filled with armed criminals who were monitoring his every move and communicating with each other using sophisticated radio equipment. The convoy stayed together on Interstate 10 for the first 30 miles, maintaining the appearance of normal highway traffic while actually operating as a coordinated criminal unit. Miguel could see the occupants of the escort vehicles watching him carefully and occasionally speaking into radio microphones. Federal law enforcement surveillance teams were also monitoring the convoy, but they had to maintain significant distance to avoid detection by the criminals' counter-surveillance efforts. The criminals were clearly experienced in operational security and were taking precautions against law enforcement interference. About an hour into the journey, the convoy left Interstate 10 and began following a series of back roads that led into the hill country west of San Antonio. The route was taking them through increasingly remote areas where law enforcement backup would be farther away and criminal activities could be conducted with less risk of detection. Miguel's hidden communication equipment allowed him to maintain contact with Agent Collins and the support teams, but the radio transmissions had to be brief and coded to avoid detection by the criminals' monitoring equipment. "Route deviation confirmed. Proceeding into remote area," Miguel transmitted. "Multiple escort vehicles maintaining close surveillance." "Copy that," Agent Collins responded. "Tactical teams are repositioning to maintain coverage. Continue operation, but be prepared for immediate extraction if necessary." The convoy passed through several small hill country communities, Comfort, Kerrville, and Hunt, but didn't stop at any of them. The criminals appeared to be heading for a specific destination that was isolated from populated areas and normal law enforcement patrol routes. As they drove deeper into remote country, Miguel began to recognize the tactical situation he was in. The criminals were leading him into terrain where they would have every advantage: isolated locations, limited escape routes, and no immediate access to help if something went wrong. But Miguel also knew that this was exactly the kind of situation that law enforcement needed to understand the criminal network's operations and gather evidence that could be used to prosecute them effectively. The convoy's destination turned out to be a remote ranch complex about 20 miles northwest of Kerrville, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through rugged hill country terrain. The facility appeared to be a legitimate cattle ranch from the outside, but Miguel could see signs of recent modification and fortification that suggested it was being used for criminal purposes. The main ranch house had been equipped with sophisticated communications equipment, including satellite dishes and radio antennas that would allow the criminals to monitor law enforcement frequencies and coordinate operations across a wide area. Several outbuildings had been converted into what appeared to be storage and processing facilities. Most ominously, Miguel could see evidence of recent excavation work behind the main buildings. Fresh earth and disturbed ground that suggested the criminals had been digging graves for their victims in the remote ranch location. As Miguel backed his truck up to a loading dock near one of the outbuildings, he was surrounded by at least a dozen armed individuals who were clearly experienced in criminal operations. Their weapons, equipment, and tactical organization indicated a level of professionalism that was far beyond typical truck hijacking operations. The leader of the criminal group, a man in his 40s who introduced himself only as Colonel, approached Miguel with the confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. "Mr. Santos, we've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time," the colonel said. "Your reputation precedes you, and we have some business to discuss regarding your previous interference with our associates' operations." Miguel realized that he had been lured to the ranch not just to be robbed or killed, but to be interrogated about law enforcement methods and to serve as an example to other drivers who might consider cooperating with authorities. "I don't know what you're talking about," Miguel replied, trying to maintain the pretense that he was just a driver making a routine delivery. "Please don't insult our intelligence," the colonel responded. "We know exactly who you are, what you've done, and why you're here. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with us voluntarily or whether we'll need to use more persuasive methods." Miguel used his hidden communication equipment to send a prearranged distress signal to the law enforcement teams. "Package delivered. Situation compromised. Requesting immediate tactical support." He transmitted using emergency codes, but he wasn't sure if his transmission had been received, or if help would arrive in time to prevent the criminals from carrying out whatever plans they had for him. The criminals escorted Miguel into the main ranch house, where they had prepared what was obviously an interrogation facility. The room contained chairs equipped with restraints, video recording equipment, and various tools that Miguel recognized as instruments of torture. "We're going to have a conversation about your cooperation with federal law enforcement," the colonel explained as his men secured Miguel to one of the chairs. "We want to know everything about their investigation methods, their surveillance techniques, and their plans for operations against our organization." Miguel realized that the criminals viewed him as a source of intelligence about law enforcement capabilities, not just as a target for revenge. They wanted to extract information that would help them avoid capture and continue their criminal operations. "I was just a witness," Miguel said. "I don't know anything about law enforcement methods or investigations." "Mr. Santos, we've done extensive research on your case. We know that you spent weeks working with federal agents, that you provided detailed testimony about criminal operations, and that you continue to serve as a consultant for law enforcement agencies. You have exactly the kind of information we need." The colonel activated the video recording equipment and began a systematic interrogation designed to extract every detail of Miguel's knowledge about law enforcement methods. The questions were specific and informed, indicating that the criminals had access to detailed information about the original investigation and prosecution. Meanwhile, Miguel was using his training in resistance to interrogation to provide misleading information while appearing to cooperate with his captors. He gave them enough accurate details to maintain credibility while withholding the most sensitive information about law enforcement capabilities. But the interrogation was also serving as a delay tactic, while Miguel hoped that federal agents were tracking his location and preparing a rescue operation. His hidden communication equipment was still functioning, and he was sending periodic status updates whenever the criminals weren't directly monitoring him. "Tactical situation stable. Maintaining cover. Location confirmed," Miguel transmitted during a brief break in the questioning. Agent Collins' voice came back through his concealed earpiece. "Tactical teams in position, preparing for assault. Maintain your position and be ready for immediate extraction." Miguel realized that help was on the way, but he had to survive the interrogation long enough for the rescue operation to succeed. The federal law enforcement assault on the criminal ranch complex began at exactly 4:30 p.m., coordinated between FBI tactical teams, Texas Rangers, and local sheriff's deputies who had surrounded the facility during Miguel's interrogation. The operation was planned to minimize the risk to Miguel while maximizing the capture of criminals and evidence. Snipers took out the perimeter guards simultaneously, while tactical teams breached the main buildings from multiple directions to prevent the criminals from harming their prisoner. Miguel heard the first sounds of the assault: gunfire, explosions, and shouted commands, while he was still secured in the interrogation room. The colonel and his men immediately realized they were under attack and began preparing to use Miguel as a hostage to negotiate their escape. "Federal agents, this is Colonel Martinez," the criminal leader shouted into a radio microphone. "We have your witness, and will kill him if you don't withdraw immediately." But the federal tactical teams were prepared for hostage situations and had positioned sharpshooters with clear lines of sight into the main ranch house. When the colonel moved to threaten Miguel directly, he was immediately neutralized by a precise sniper shot. The other criminals in the building surrendered quickly once they realized that law enforcement had overwhelming tactical advantage and that their leader was dead. The entire assault lasted less than 15 minutes from start to finish. Miguel was freed from the restraints and evacuated from the ranch complex by paramedics who examined him for injuries. Despite the psychological stress of the interrogation, he had not been physically harmed and was able to provide immediate debriefing information to law enforcement commanders. "Are you all right?" Agent Collins asked as Miguel was being checked by medical personnel. "I'm fine," Miguel replied, "but these people were more organized and dangerous than the original network. They had detailed intelligence about law enforcement methods and were planning operations across multiple states." The search of the ranch complex revealed evidence of an extensive criminal organization that had been planning truck hijacking operations throughout the southwestern United States. Law enforcement teams found weapons, communications equipment, stolen cargo, and documents that provided information about criminal contacts in multiple cities. Most disturbing was the discovery of a mass grave site behind the ranch buildings containing the remains of at least 8 truck drivers who had been murdered by the criminal network over the past 2 years. The evidence seized during the ranch raid revealed that the criminal organization Miguel had encountered was significantly larger and more sophisticated than anyone had suspected. The network operated cells in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, with connections to organized crime groups in Mexico and other international criminal organizations. Federal investigators found detailed files on hundreds of truck drivers, including personal information, route schedules, and cargo manifests that had been obtained through systematic surveillance and infiltration of the trucking industry. The criminals had been selecting targets based on cargo value, route vulnerability, and the likelihood that drivers would be missed if they disappeared. The organization's financial records showed that they had stolen cargo worth over $50 million in the past 3 years, operating a sophisticated fencing network that could quickly dispose of hijacked goods through legitimate-appearing business channels. Most shocking was the discovery that the criminal network had infiltrated multiple trucking companies, truck stops, and even some law enforcement agencies. They had been receiving intelligence from corrupt employees and officials who were being paid to provide information about valuable loads and law enforcement activities. Agent Collins briefed Miguel on the scope of the investigation during his extended debriefing at the FBI field office in San Antonio. "This case is going to result in the largest truck hijacking prosecution in U.S. history," she told him. "Your courage in participating in this operation has broken up a criminal network that was responsible for hundreds of hijackings and dozens of murders." The investigation led to arrests in 6 states and the seizure of assets worth over $20 million. Federal prosecutors filed charges against 47 individuals, ranging from low-level operatives to high-ranking organizers who had been directing criminal activities from locations as far away as Miami and Los Angeles. Miguel's testimony would again be crucial for the prosecution, but this time he would be providing evidence about an even more sophisticated and dangerous criminal organization than the one he had first encountered in Dead Man's Canyon. "The difference is that this time, we completely dismantled their network," Agent Collins explained. "We've arrested their leadership, seized their assets, and eliminated their operational capability. They won't be able to reconstitute their organization or threaten other drivers." But Miguel knew that as long as valuable cargo traveled on remote highways, there would always be criminals willing to prey on truck drivers. His experience had taught him that vigilance and preparation were the only reliable defenses against the dangers that lurked on America's highways. The successful prosecution of the second criminal network had far-reaching effects on the trucking industry and law enforcement approaches to transportation crime. Miguel's case became a model for how drivers and law enforcement could work together to combat organized criminal activity. The Trucking Security Act of 2027, which was passed by Congress in response to the revelations about criminal infiltration of the industry, mandated new security standards for trucking companies, established federal funding for transportation crime task forces, and created whistleblower protections for drivers who reported criminal activity. Miguel was invited to testify before congressional committees about the threats facing truck drivers and the need for enhanced security measures. His first-hand experience with 2 different criminal networks gave him unique credibility when discussing the evolution of threats and the effectiveness of various countermeasures. "The criminals are becoming more sophisticated," Miguel told the House Transportation Committee during his testimony. "They're using advanced technology, they have better intelligence capabilities, and they're more willing to use violence against anyone who interferes with their operations." Miguel's recommendations led to the establishment of the Federal Transportation Crime Task Force, a multi-agency organization dedicated to investigating and prosecuting criminal networks that targeted the trucking industry. The task force was given resources and authority to coordinate investigations across state lines and to work with international law enforcement partners. The trucking industry also implemented new security protocols based on lessons learned from Miguel's cases. Companies began using encrypted communications, implemented better driver check-in procedures, and established partnerships with law enforcement agencies to share intelligence about potential threats. But perhaps most importantly, Miguel's story became part of the standard training curriculum for new truck drivers. His experiences were used to teach drivers how to recognize dangerous situations, how to respond to criminal threats, and how to work with law enforcement to protect themselves and their colleagues. Every new driver learns about the Miguel Santos protocols, explained Bobby Hutchins, who had become a regional training director at Rio Grande Transport. His experiences have probably saved more lives than we'll ever know. Miguel's reputation within the trucking community had evolved from that of a lucky survivor to a respected expert whose knowledge and experience were considered invaluable for industry safety and security. Despite his success in helping law enforcement combat criminal networks, Miguel's experiences had taken a significant personal toll. The stress of being targeted by dangerous criminals, the responsibility of serving as a witness in major federal cases, and the constant awareness of threats had affected both his health and his family relationships. Miguel's wife, Maria, had been supportive throughout his involvement with law enforcement, but the prolonged stress and security concerns had strained their marriage. The couple had postponed having children because of safety concerns, and Maria had been forced to change her own career plans due to the security restrictions that affected their lives. "I'm proud of what you've done," Maria told Miguel during one of their discussions about their future. "But I want to have a normal life where we're not constantly looking over our shoulders for criminals who want to hurt us." Miguel's physical health had also been affected by years of stress and hypervigilance. He suffered from insomnia, hypertension, and anxiety symptoms that required medical treatment and ongoing counseling. The financial compensation Miguel received for his cooperation with law enforcement had been substantial, but it couldn't offset the personal costs of his involvement in dangerous criminal cases. He had been forced to live with security restrictions that limited his freedom and affected his relationships with friends and family. Miguel consulted with counselors who specialized in helping law enforcement witnesses cope with the psychological effects of their experiences. The counseling helped him understand that his reactions were normal responses to abnormal situations, and that healing would require time and ongoing support. "You've been through experiences that would traumatize anyone," his counselor explained. "The fact that you've maintained your moral courage and continued to help others despite the personal costs shows remarkable strength of character." Miguel also found support from other law enforcement witnesses who had faced similar challenges. The Federal Witness Protection Program provided resources for witnesses who needed ongoing assistance in dealing with the consequences of their cooperation with law enforcement. But Miguel was determined not to let his experiences with criminals define the rest of his life. He wanted to use his knowledge and expertise in ways that would help other drivers while allowing him to build a more normal personal life. 5 years after his first encounter in Dead Man's Canyon, Miguel Santos had become one of the most respected figures in the American trucking industry. His expertise in transportation security was sought after by companies, law enforcement agencies, and industry organizations throughout the country. Miguel established the Santos Transportation Security Institute, a nonprofit organization that provided training and resources to help truck drivers recognize and avoid criminal threats. The institute worked with trucking companies, law enforcement agencies, and government organizations to develop improved security protocols and training programs. "Our mission is to make sure that no driver has to go through what I experienced," Miguel explained during the institute's founding ceremony. "We want to give drivers the knowledge and tools they need to protect themselves and their cargo from criminal activity." The Institute's training programs were based on Miguel's real-world experiences and included practical instruction in threat recognition, defensive driving, emergency communications, and cooperation with law enforcement. The programs were mandatory for drivers working for many major trucking companies, and were endorsed by industry organizations and federal agencies. Miguel also worked as a consultant for law enforcement agencies developing strategies to combat transportation crime. His insights into criminal methods and his understanding of trucking industry operations made him valuable for designing effective countermeasures and prevention programs. But perhaps Miguel's most important contribution was his role in changing the culture of the trucking industry. His example had shown that drivers could successfully resist criminal threats, and that cooperation with law enforcement was both possible and beneficial for the entire industry. Miguel Santos proved that truckers don't have to be victims, said Captain Robert Hayes, who had led the original investigation into the Dead Man's Canyon network. His courage and intelligence have made all of America's highways safer for truck drivers. Miguel's personal life had also stabilized as the immediate threats from criminal networks diminished. He and Maria had been able to start a family, and they were raising 2 young children in a secure environment with the support of ongoing law enforcement protection programs. Miguel continued to drive professionally, but his routes were now carefully planned to avoid unnecessary risks while allowing him to maintain his connection to the trucking community. He used his regular interactions with other drivers to gather intelligence about emerging threats and to provide informal security advice. "I'm still a trucker first," Miguel would tell people who asked about his various roles and responsibilities. "Everything else I do is just an extension of looking out for my fellow drivers and making sure they can do their jobs safely." Miguel's story had become part of the mythology of American trucking, a reminder that ordinary people could face extraordinary challenges and emerge stronger for the experience. His legacy was measured not just in the criminals who had been arrested or the cargo that had been protected, but in the countless drivers who had learned from his experience and used that knowledge to stay safe on the highways. The road ahead would always contain unknown dangers, but Miguel had proven that those dangers could be recognized, resisted, and ultimately overcome by drivers who were prepared, alert, and willing to stand up for themselves and their colleagues. The neon sign of the big Texan truck stop cast an eerie red glow across the parking lot as Wayne Mitchell pulled his midnight blue Kenworth W900 into a space near the back of the lot. It was 9:45 p.m. on a cold February evening in Amarillo, and Wayne was taking his mandatory rest break before pushing on to Denver with a load of cattle feed. Wayne had been an owner-operator for 15 years, running his own truck and hauling freight throughout the Southwest. At 52 years old, he was a veteran of the highway who had seen just about everything the trucking life could throw at a man. But tonight, he was about to hear a story that would shake him to his core. As Wayne completed his post-trip inspection and settled into the driver's lounge with a cup of coffee, he noticed another driver sitting alone at a corner table, staring into his coffee cup with the haunted expression of a man carrying a terrible burden. The driver appeared to be in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of highway driving. Wayne recognized the look. It was the expression of someone who had experienced something on the road that they couldn't quite process or forget. In 15 years of trucking, Wayne had seen that look on the faces of drivers who had witnessed fatal accidents, encountered dangerous criminals, or simply been pushed to their breaking point by the isolation and stress of long-haul driving. The driver looked up as Wayne approached, and Wayne could see desperation in his eyes. "You mind if I sit down?" Wayne asked, gesturing toward an empty chair at the table. The driver nodded without speaking, then looked around the nearly empty driver's lounge to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Name's Roy Patterson," the driver said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Been driving for 28 years and I thought I'd seen everything there was to see out here. But 3 nights ago I encountered something that's been eating at me ever since." Wayne could see that Roy was genuinely distressed about whatever had happened to him. The man's hands were shaking slightly as he held his coffee cup, and there was a haunted quality to his voice that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "What happened?" Wayne asked, settling into his chair and preparing to listen to whatever story Roy needed to tell. Roy looked around the lounge again, then leaned forward across the table and began speaking in a low, urgent tone that immediately captured Wayne's attention. "I was hauling a load of oil field equipment from Houston to Midland," Roy began, "running behind schedule due to weather delays, so I was pushing hard to make up time. It was about 2 a.m. when I stopped at that old truck stop outside of Sweetwater. You know the one, been there since the 1970s. Kind of run down, but still gets a lot of business from drivers who remember when it was the best stop between Dallas and El Paso." Wayne knew the truck stop Roy was referring to, Morrison's Travel Plaza, a classic old-school facility that had been serving truckers for decades. It wasn't the fanciest stop on the highway, but it had a reputation for honest prices, good food, and owners who understood the trucking business. "Go on," Wayne said, sensing that Roy was working up the courage to tell him something that was genuinely disturbing. Roy took a sip of his coffee, then continued his story in the same low, haunted tone. "I pulled into Morrison's around 2:15 a.m., planning to grab some fuel and maybe a sandwich before pushing on to Midland. Place was pretty quiet, just a few trucks in the lot, couple of cars at the fuel islands. Normal late-night scene, nothing out of the ordinary." Roy paused, staring into his coffee cup as if he could see the events he was describing replaying in the dark liquid. "I was walking toward the main building when this guy approached me from between two parked trucks. He was maybe 35 years old, wearing work clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. But what got my attention was the expression on his face. Pure desperation, like a man who was drowning and looking for someone to throw him a rope." Wayne leaned forward, intrigued by Roy's story and the obvious emotional impact it was having on the normally stoic driver. "The guy says to me, 'Are you a truck driver?' When I said yes, he grabbed my arm. Not aggressive, but like he was afraid I might walk away before he could talk to me. He says, 'I need help. I need someone who travels the highways to help me get word to my family.'" "What kind of word?" Wayne asked. "That's exactly what I asked him. And his answer," Roy shook his head, as if he still couldn't believe what he had heard. "He told me his name was David Hernandez, and that he'd been missing for 3 years. Said his family thought he was dead, but he'd been held prisoner by people who forced him to work at illegal operations throughout West Texas." Roy's voice dropped even lower, and he glanced around the truck stop lounge again to make sure they weren't being overheard. Wayne, this guy was scared out of his mind. He kept looking over his shoulder, jumping at every sound. He told me that he'd finally managed to escape from wherever they'd been keeping him, but that he couldn't go to the police because some of the people who'd been holding him were law enforcement officers. Wayne felt a chill run down his spine. Stories of corruption and criminal activity involving law enforcement weren't uncommon in the remote areas of West Texas, where the vast distances and sparse population created opportunities for illegal operations. "What did he want you to do?" Wayne asked. "He wanted me to contact his wife in San Angelo and tell her that he was alive but in hiding. He gave me her name, Maria Hernandez, and their old address on West Avenue. He said he couldn't call her himself because he was afraid their phones were being monitored by the people who'd been holding him." Roy pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and showed it to Wayne. Written in pencil in shaky handwriting were the words, "Maria Hernandez, 1247 West Avenue, San Angelo, Texas," along with a phone number. "Did you believe his story?" Wayne asked. Roy was quiet for a long moment, then looked directly at Wayne with eyes that held both conviction and fear. "Wayne, I've been driving trucks for almost 30 years. I've met every kind of person you can imagine. Honest folks, criminals, liars, con artists, people who were mentally ill, people who were desperate. And I'm telling you, this man was telling the truth. Whatever had happened to him, it was real, and it was terrible." Roy continued his account,
his voice becoming more urgent as he described the rest of his encounter with the desperate stranger. David told me more of his story while we stood there in that truck stop parking lot. He said he'd been driving truck himself back in 2021, hauling loads for a small company out of San Angelo. One night he was making a delivery to what was supposed to be a construction site near Fort Stockton when he was ambushed by armed men who knocked him unconscious. Wayne could see that Roy was becoming more agitated as he recalled the stranger's story. The veteran driver's hands were trembling slightly, and he kept glancing toward the windows as if he expected to see someone watching them. According to David, when he woke up, he was in some kind of compound in the middle of the desert. The people who'd taken him told him that he now worked for them, and that if he tried to escape or contact anyone, they'd kill him and his family. What kind of work were they forcing him to do? Wayne asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer wouldn't be something he wanted to hear. Moving drugs, Wayne. They had a whole operation set up where they'd use truckers to transport drugs and other illegal cargo throughout Texas, New Mexico, and Mexico. But these weren't willing participants. They were prisoners who'd been kidnapped and forced to work under threat of death. Roy pulled out his phone and showed Wayne a news article he'd found online. The headline read, "San Angelo truck driver missing since September 2021, and included a photograph of a man who matched the description of the person Roy had encountered. "I looked this up after I got home," Roy explained. David Hernandez really did disappear in September 2021. His truck was found abandoned near Fort Stockton, and the police investigation went nowhere. His family held a memorial service for him in 2022 after he was declared legally dead. Wayne studied the photograph and the article, feeling a growing sense of unease about the implications of Roy's story. If the stranger was telling the truth, it meant there was a criminal organization operating in West Texas that was kidnapping truck drivers and forcing them to participate in illegal activities. "What else did he tell you?" Wayne asked. "He said there were at least a dozen other drivers being held at various locations throughout the region. Some had been there for years, completely cut off from their families and the outside world. The criminals would move them around to different compounds to prevent them from becoming too familiar with any one location." Roy paused and took another sip of his coffee, his hands still shaking slightly. "But here's the part that really scared me, Wayne. David said the reason he was finally able to escape was that the criminals were planning to eliminate some of the older prisoners and replace them with newer kidnapping victims. He overheard them discussing which drivers were going to be retired and realized that he was on the list." The implications of Roy's story were becoming more disturbing with each detail. If accurate, it suggested that a sophisticated criminal network was operating throughout remote areas of Texas, using kidnapped truck drivers as slave labor for drug trafficking operations. Roy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object that he placed on the table between them. It was a driver's license, worn and faded, but clearly readable in the fluorescent light of the truck stop lounge. "David gave me this," Roy said. "Told me it was proof of who he was and what had happened to him. Said I should show it to his wife when I contacted her." Wayne picked up the license and examined it carefully. It was a Texas commercial driver's license issued to David Hernandez, with an address in San Angelo and an expiration date that would have been current at the time of his disappearance in 2021. "This looks legitimate," Wayne said, though he wasn't an expert in identifying fraudulent documents. "That's what I thought. But there's something else." Roy pulled out his phone and showed Wayne a photograph he had taken. "David also showed me this." The photograph was dark and grainy, obviously taken with poor lighting, but it clearly showed what appeared to be a truck yard or compound with multiple commercial vehicles parked inside a fenced area. Some of the trucks looked abandoned or damaged, while others appeared to be in operational condition. "He took this with a phone he managed to steal from one of the guards," Roy explained. "Said it showed part of the compound where he'd been held prisoner. Look at those trucks, Wayne. Some of them matched the descriptions of vehicles that have been reported stolen or involved in missing driver cases. Wayne studied the photograph more carefully and could see that Roy was right. Several of the trucks in the image appeared to match descriptions he remembered from CB radio broadcasts about missing drivers and stolen vehicles. "Did he say where this compound was located?" Wayne asked. "Somewhere in the desert between Fort Stockton and Sanderson, but he wasn't sure of the exact location. Said they always transported the prisoners in vehicles with covered windows, so they couldn't see landmarks or figure out where they were being taken." Roy put his phone away and leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted by the emotional strain of retelling David's story. "Wayne, I've been carrying this information for 3 days, and I don't know what to do with it. I promised David I'd contact his wife, but I'm scared that if I get involved, I might end up in the same situation he was in." Wayne could understand Roy's dilemma. Getting involved in a situation like this could be dangerous, especially if it involved criminal organizations that had demonstrated a willingness to kidnap and murder people. But ignoring the information could mean abandoning other victims who were still being held prisoner. "Have you thought about going to the police?" Wayne asked. Roy shook his head grimly. "David specifically warned me not to trust local law enforcement. He said some of the people guarding the prisoners were wearing police uniforms, and that the criminals seemed to have advance warning whenever law enforcement operations were being planned in their area." Roy's internal struggle was evident as he continued his account of the encounter with David Hernandez. He was clearly torn between his promise to help a desperate man and his fear of getting involved in something that could endanger his own life and family. "I went home to Lubbock and spent 2 days thinking about what David had told me," Roy continued. "I kept looking at that driver's license and that photograph, wondering if I was holding evidence of crimes that most people couldn't even imagine were happening." Wayne could see the weight of the decision Roy had been carrying. As truck drivers, they were used to being independent and self-reliant, but this situation required making moral choices that went far beyond the normal challenges of life on the road. Finally, yesterday morning, I decided I had to at least try to contact his wife. I figured if David was lying or confused, she'd be able to tell me that he was mistaken about his identity or his family situation. Roy pulled out his phone and scrolled through his call history until he found the number David had given him. "I called the number around noon, when I figured she'd be home from work, but before it got too late in the day. A woman answered, and when I asked if this was Maria Hernandez, she said yes." "What did you tell her?" Wayne asked. "I told her I was a truck driver who had met someone claiming to be her husband. I said this person had given me her contact information and asked me to call her. I didn't want to get her hopes up if it turned out to be some kind of scam or mistake." Roy paused and took a deep breath before continuing. "Wayne, the reaction I got from that woman convinced me that David was telling the truth. As soon as I mentioned that someone claiming to be David Hernandez had asked me to contact her, she started crying. She said she'd never stopped believing that her husband was alive somewhere, even though the police had given up looking for him." Wayne felt a chill as he realized the emotional impact that Roy's phone call must have had on a woman who had been grieving her husband's disappearance for over 3 years. "I told her some of what David had said, that he was alive but couldn't contact her directly because he was in danger. I didn't go into the details about the kidnapping and forced labor because I wasn't sure how much she could handle over the phone." "How did she respond?" Wayne asked. "She asked me dozens of questions. Things only her real husband would know. She asked about their anniversary date, their children's names, where they'd gone on their last vacation. And Wayne, I had answers to all those questions because David had told me those exact details when we talked." Roy showed Wayne a handwritten note that contained personal information about David Hernandez's family, names, dates, addresses, and other details that would be difficult for a stranger to fake convincingly. "She also told me something that made me realize how serious this situation really is," Roy continued. "She said that about 6 months after David disappeared, She started receiving anonymous phone calls. The caller would tell her that David was dead and that she should stop asking questions about what happened to him. The calls were always from different numbers, and when she tried to trace them, they led to disconnected phones or fake accounts. Wayne was becoming increasingly convinced that Roy's story was genuine and that they were dealing with a serious criminal situation that required law enforcement intervention, despite David's warnings about police corruption. "Roy, this is bigger than just one missing truck driver," Wayne said. "If what you're telling me is true, there's a criminal organization that's been kidnapping people and forcing them into slave labor. We can't handle this on our own." Roy nodded reluctantly. "I know you're right, but I'm scared, Wayne. These people have been operating for years without being caught. They have resources, they have connections, and they've demonstrated that they're willing to kill people to protect their operation." Wayne understood Roy's fear, but he also knew that they had a moral obligation to help David and the other victims who were supposedly being held prisoner. "What if we contacted the FBI instead of local police?" Wayne suggested. "Federal agents would be less likely to be compromised by local corruption, and they'd have the resources to investigate a multi-county criminal operation." Roy considered this suggestion for a moment, then pulled out his phone and showed Wayne another news article he had found. "I've been doing research since I got home," Roy said. "Look at this. It's about a federal task force that's been investigating human trafficking and forced labor operations in the Southwest. They specifically mention cases involving truck drivers who've disappeared under suspicious circumstances." The article described a joint operation between the FBI, DEA, and Border Patrol that had been targeting criminal networks involved in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and forced labor. The task force had made several arrests and had been asking for public cooperation in identifying victims and witnesses. "There's a phone number here for reporting information about suspected trafficking operations," Wayne said, pointing to the bottom of the article. "Maybe this is the right place to start." Roy looked at the article and the phone number, but Wayne could see that he was still hesitant about getting involved with law enforcement. "What if I call them anonymously?" Roy suggested. "I could provide the information about David and the compound location without giving my own name or contact information." Wayne shook his head. "Roy, if this is real, those agents are going to need more than an anonymous tip. They'll need witnesses, evidence, and detailed information about the criminal operation, and they'll probably need David's testimony to build a case that can actually put these people in prison." Roy was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup and wrestling with the decision that could change his life and potentially put him in danger. Finally, he looked up at Wayne with an expression of grim determination. "You're right," Roy said. "If I don't do something, David and those other drivers will never get home to their families, and more truckers are going to disappear." Roy picked up his phone and dialed the number from the article. The FBI field office in Lubbock took Roy's call seriously, and within 2 hours he was sitting in an interview room with Special Agent Lisa Martinez, who specialized in human trafficking and organized crime investigations. Wayne had accompanied Roy to the FBI office to provide moral support and to serve as a witness to his friend's account of the encounter with David Hernandez. Agent Martinez was a professional woman in her late 30s who had the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had dealt with serious criminal cases before. She listened to Roy's story without interrupting, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions about specific details. "Mr. Patterson, the information you've provided is consistent with other intelligence we've been gathering about forced labor operations in West Texas," Agent Martinez said after Roy had finished his account. "We've been investigating reports of missing truck drivers and suspicious activity in the region between Fort Stockton and the Mexican border." Wayne felt a chill as he realized that Roy's encounter with David might be connected to a larger pattern of criminal activity that federal agents were already tracking. "How many other cases are you investigating?" Roy asked. "Over the past 5 years, we've documented 17 cases of commercial truck drivers who disappeared under suspicious circumstances in this region. In most cases, their vehicles were found abandoned, but the drivers were never located. Agent Martinez showed Roy and Wayne a map of West Texas with red pins marking the locations where trucks had been found and where drivers had last been seen. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to the cluster of pins in the desert region between Fort Stockton and Sanderson. "Almost all of these incidents occurred within a 50-mile radius of the area where your contact claimed to have been held prisoner." The map made it clear that David's story was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of criminal activity that had been ongoing for years. "What happens now?" Wayne asked. "We're going to need Mr. Patterson to work with us to reestablish contact with David Hernandez," Agent Martinez explained. "If he's really a victim of human trafficking, he could provide us with the intelligence we need to locate the criminal operation and rescue other victims." Roy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Agent Martinez, David specifically told me that he couldn't trust law enforcement because some of the people holding him prisoner were police officers. That's why we're handling this as a federal investigation rather than involving local agencies," Agent Martinez replied. "We have reason to believe that the criminal network has compromised some local law enforcement personnel, but federal agents wouldn't have the same conflicts of interest." Agent Martinez explained that the FBI had been building a case against what they believed was a sophisticated criminal organization that used various forms of coercion and deception to recruit unwilling participants for illegal activities. "Based on our investigation, this organization has been kidnapping truck drivers, migrant workers, and other vulnerable individuals to use as forced labor in drug trafficking, human smuggling, and other criminal enterprises," she said. The scope of the criminal operation was larger and more organized than Roy had imagined from his single encounter with David. Agent Martinez outlined a plan for Roy to reestablish contact with David Hernandez while working with federal agents to gather intelligence about the criminal operation. The plan would require Roy to return to Morrison's Travel Plaza and hope that David would approach him again. But this time Roy would be equipped with recording equipment and federal backup. "We believe that David is probably still in the area, trying to find help or gather resources for a more permanent escape," Agent Martinez explained. "Trafficking victims often struggle to reintegrate into normal society, especially if they've been isolated for extended periods." Roy was clearly nervous about the plan, but he agreed to cooperate with the investigation. "What if the criminals realize that I'm working with law enforcement? What if they come after me?" "We'll have surveillance teams monitoring your location, and you'll be equipped with emergency communication equipment," Agent Martinez assured him. "If the situation becomes dangerous, we can extract you immediately." Wayne volunteered to accompany Roy on the operation, both to provide moral support and to serve as an additional witness to any information that David might provide. 2 days later, Roy and Wayne were back at Morrison's Travel Plaza, this time equipped with hidden recording devices and in radio contact with FBI surveillance teams positioned around the truck stop. The plan was for Roy to maintain his normal trucking routine while staying alert for any sign of David. The first night produced no results. Roy and Wayne spent several hours at the truck stop without seeing David or anyone matching his description. But Agent Martinez had warned them that establishing contact might require multiple attempts. On the second night, around 1:30 a.m., Wayne spotted a figure moving between parked trucks in the back section of the lot. The person appeared to be watching the main building while avoiding the well-lit areas near the fuel islands. "Roy, I think he's here," Wayne whispered into his radio microphone. Roy approached the area where Wayne had seen the figure, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible to show that he wasn't a threat. After several minutes of careful maneuvering through the parked trucks, Roy found David hiding behind a trailer, looking even more haggard and frightened than he had during their first encounter. "David, it's Roy Patterson. We talked 3 nights ago. I called your wife like you asked." David emerged from his hiding place, but Wayne could see that he was extremely agitated and paranoid. "Did you bring anyone with you?" David asked, looking around nervously. Just my friend Wayne. He's another truck driver and he's here to help. David studied Wayne carefully, then seemed to reach a decision about trusting them. I can't stay here long, David said. They're looking for me. I think they know I escaped, and they're checking truck stops and other places where I might go for help. David's second encounter with Roy provided much more detailed information about the criminal operation that had held him prisoner for 3 years. Speaking in urgent, whispered tones while constantly watching for potential threats, David described a sophisticated network that was far more extensive than anyone had suspected. There are at least 4 different compounds that I know of, David explained to Roy and Wayne. They move prisoners between the locations every few weeks so that no one becomes too familiar with the local geography or develops escape plans. David described the compounds as heavily guarded facilities in remote desert locations, equipped with fencing, surveillance equipment, and armed guards who maintained constant watch over the prisoners. Most of the guards are ex-military or former law enforcement, David continued. They know how to run a secure operation, and they have connections that help them stay ahead of legitimate law enforcement investigations. David explained that the prisoners were forced to drive trucks on various illegal missions, transporting drugs from Mexico, moving stolen cargo between states, and sometimes picking up new kidnapping victims who had been lured into traps similar to his own original capture. They have a whole system for identifying potential targets, David said. They monitor CB radio traffic, watch social media accounts, and even have informants at truck stops who provide information about drivers who are traveling alone or carrying valuable cargo. Wayne felt sick as he realized the scope of the criminal operation and the level of planning that went into targeting innocent truck drivers. How many other prisoners are there? Roy asked. When I escaped, there were at least 15 other drivers being held at various locations. Some had been there longer than me. There was one guy who said he'd been a prisoner for over 5 years. They told us that if we ever tried to escape or contact anyone, they'd kill us and our families. David provided specific details about the locations of the compounds, the identities of some of the guards and organizers, and the methods used to transport prisoners and illegal cargo. The information was exactly what federal agents needed to plan rescue operations and make arrests. But David also revealed something that made the situation even more urgent than Roy and Wayne had realized. They're planning to eliminate some of the older prisoners soon, David said. I heard the guards talking about it before I escaped. They said they needed to make room for new victims, and that some of us had been there too long and knew too much about their operation. The implications were chilling. The criminal organization was apparently planning to murder their long-term prisoners to prevent them from becoming liabilities. David gave Roy additional evidence to support his claims, including photographs he had taken with the stolen phone and written notes describing the locations and security measures of the compounds. You have to get this information to the FBI, David pleaded. Those people are going to die if someone doesn't help them soon. Roy immediately transmitted David's information to Agent Martinez and the FBI surveillance teams, who recognized the urgency of the situation and began coordinating an immediate response. Within hours, federal agents, border patrol officers, and specialized tactical teams were mobilizing to assault the criminal compounds and rescue the prisoners. The operation, designated Operation Highway Freedom, involved multiple agencies and over 200 law enforcement personnel. Using David's intelligence about compound locations and security measures, tactical teams simultaneously attacked 4 different facilities scattered throughout the remote desert region of West Texas. Roy, Wayne, and David were evacuated to a secure FBI facility where they could provide additional intelligence and testimony while the rescue operations were conducted. David was placed in protective custody and provided with medical attention for injuries and malnutrition he had suffered during his captivity. The raids were successful beyond anyone's expectations. Federal agents rescued 18 kidnapped truck drivers, 3 migrant workers, and 2 other victims who had been held prisoner for periods ranging from 6 months to over 6 years.
They also seized weapons, vehicles, drugs, and financial records that provided evidence of the criminal organization's extensive illegal activities. 37 individuals were arrested in connection with the trafficking operation, including several law enforcement officers who had been providing intelligence and protection to the criminals. The arrested individuals faced federal charges, including kidnapping, human trafficking, drug smuggling, and conspiracy. David was reunited with his wife Maria and their children in an emotional scene at the FBI facility. The family had been separated for over 3 years, and the reunion was covered extensively by local and national media as an example of successful law enforcement cooperation with civilian witnesses. "I never stopped believing that David was alive," Maria told reporters, "and I'll never be able to thank Roy Patterson enough for having the courage to get involved and help bring my husband home." Roy's decision to trust David's story and cooperate with federal investigators had led to the rescue of nearly 24 victims and the dismantling of a criminal operation that had been terrorizing truck drivers throughout the Southwest for years. The investigation revealed that the criminal network had been responsible for at least 40 kidnappings over a 5-year period, with annual profits from drug trafficking and other illegal activities estimated at over $50 million. Roy returned to his trucking career, but his experience with David Hernandez had changed his perspective on the responsibilities that truck drivers had to look out for each other and report criminal activity to appropriate authorities. "I almost didn't get involved," Roy told Wayne as they sat in the same truck stop where the story had begun. "I was scared, and I didn't want to believe that something so horrible could be happening to people in our industry." Wayne nodded, understanding the moral complexity of the situation Roy had faced. "But you did the right thing. You saved a lot of lives by listening to David and taking his story seriously." Roy's courage in reporting David's story became legendary within the trucking community, and his experience was used by law enforcement agencies to train officers about the signs of human trafficking and the importance of taking reports from civilian witnesses seriously. The case also led to improved communication and cooperation between federal agencies and the trucking industry, with new protocols for reporting suspicious activity and protecting drivers who were willing to serve as witnesses in criminal investigations. David Hernandez eventually returned to truck driving, but he also became an advocate for other trafficking victims and worked with law enforcement agencies to identify and combat criminal operations that targeted transportation workers. The criminal network that had held him prisoner was completely dismantled, but David's experience served as a reminder that the vast emptiness of the American Southwest would always contain dangers for travelers who were unlucky enough to encounter the wrong people at the wrong time. Roy's decision to listen to a desperate stranger's story had proven that ordinary truck drivers could make a difference in fighting serious crime, and that the informal networks of communication and mutual support within the trucking community could be powerful tools for protecting innocent people from predators who viewed them as expendable resources.